Hello friends, welcome to Universe of Naruto X. If you love Naruto what if stories and anime explanations, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin today's story. Kakashi raised his eyes up from the pages of his orange-backed novel as the sound of footsteps resonated through the room he was sitting in. His ability to remain upright under his own power was a fairly recent development, but a welcome one. His strength was returning to him, if only slightly. As such, he was able to fully turn his body to face the entrance from which the sound of creaking floorboards had drawn his attention. Somewhat in contrast to his expectations, the person who stood staring at him was Satsuki. I thought you were out practicing, the Jonin said as a lead. The genin shook her head and made her way around the room to stand directly in front of him rather than forcing him to keep a twisted posture. That eye under your forehead protector. Where and how? She asked bluntly. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at her complete disregard for etiquette or conversational formalities such as transitional phrases or greetings. You could have approached that question a bit less rudely, you know, he pointed out calmly. Satsuki remained unfazed and pulled up a chair from the corner of the living room and sat herself down across from him. Fine, could you please tell me how you got yourself a sharing despite not being related to us in any way at all? That eye is a relic, she asked with a twinge of sarcasm in her voice. The silver-haired Jonin sighed at her continued lack of manners, but opted to let it slide for the sake of his sanity. It's a long story that I don't really feel like telling you. Maybe another time, he replied. The Uchiha girl stubbornly remained in her seat with her eyes fixed on Kakashi's covered iris. I think I've got the right to know. Unless you want me to make assumptions about how you got it, I'd suggest speaking up, she pressed. Kakashi laughed out loud and leaned his posture forward. Don't get ahead of yourself, kid. What you think of me or what I've experienced means just about nothing. But since you're being so persistent, I'll tell you some of it. He began, his tone, making it clear that he held absolutely no apprehension about Satsuki or her opinions toward him. A darker look then crossed over his features as he brought himself back to memories that he both held fast to and dreaded returning to. Let's just say that I got it as a gift. A gift that meant a hell of a lot to me. It still does, he said vaguely, drawing a look of skepticism from Satsuki. The girl seemed to consider what she had been told for a few moments, but when she spoke, she was as firm as she had been before, if not more so. We don't give away our sharing as a birthday present or a gesture of friendship. And for people outside of the clan, they come at a serious price, she said. Kakashi kept his expression calm, but a long sigh escaped him. It came at a brutal price. One that never would have had to have been paid if it just kept my head on my shoulders at the right time. If you're suspecting that I stole this eye, then let me assure you I didn't. I didn't want this eye. I took it out of respect when it was offered to me. He said. Satsuki studied him for a time, visibly unsure of what to think of what she was being told. Eventually, she spoke. What did it feel like when you first used it? It had to have been a new feeling, she asked. The silver-haired Jonin pondered the question carefully, as he had long grown accustomed to the sensations and alterations to his senses incurred by the Sharingan he so often hid beneath his forehead protector. I was high on adrenaline already, and I was seeing red, so I don't remember much. I do remember how destructive I felt. That level of perception, even with just one eye, it was so far beyond what I'd been capable of before, he recalled. He then eyed his student wryly. Are you asking because yours haven't awakened yet, Satsuki? He asked, drawing a reluctant nod from the uchiha girl. She then leaned back in her chair and relaxed a tad. It's frustrating. I'm 16 and I still can't use them for anything. Most uchiha have theirs by the time they're 13 or 14. It sucks, she admitted. Kakashi stroked his chin and considered his response for a few moments. From what I've heard, it usually requires something shocking to happen to you. Trauma of some kind. Things have been slow in the past few years, so it makes some sense that yours haven't manifested yet, he reasoned. Satsuki then closed her eyes and held them shut. When they remained closed for a touch too long, Kakashi began to speak again. Before he could, the girl's eyes snapped open again. They were red with the pupils rimmed by a single tamo. They nearly immediately reverted back to their basic black color. I can force it sometimes. Actually, she revealed between labored intakes of oxygen. Kakashi shook his head and touched his own covered eye. There's no point in that. It's impressive that you can do it, but like you said, you can't use them for anything. You awakened your eyes for less than 10 seconds, and you're breathing like you just ran a mile. Give it time. You'll gain access to them naturally in time. When you do, I'll do what I can to teach you how to use them, he said. Satsuki stood back up and stretched her back, which cracked several times. Learning from somebody who isn't even an Uchiha sounds weird, but beggars can't be choosers, I guess, she said with a shrug. Sensing that she was preparing to leave, Kakashi shifted back into a more relaxed posture and opened his book back to the page he had been reading prior to her arrival. How are you all doing with tree scaling? I'm probably fresh enough to help you guys if you need it, he asked. Satsuki shrugged her shoulders and waved a dismissive hand. We've mostly got it down at this point. We're almost at the top of the tree. Shikamaru hasn't been around much, though. He's been taking walks a bunch. She revealed. Kakashi looked up from his book. 3 days, and you're already near the top. Not bad at all, kid. As for Shikamaru, one or both of you should go and check on him one of these times. We're in a dangerous country right now, he said. The Uchiha girl nodded and turned to leave. Just before she could exit the room, she stopped. That eye of yours, it was a parting gift, wasn't it? She asked with her back still turned to him. Kakashi remained silent for a moment. That's one way to put it. He replied after a time. Satsuki gave a slight nod and glanced back over her shoulder at her teacher. A friend of yours, I'm guessing, she inquired curiously. The silver-haired John and let a melancholy smile form on his face beneath his ever-present mask. The bravest I've ever had. Nar absently knocked his heel against the bark of the tree on top of which he was sitting. The shape of the tree was odd, as the very peak of it possessed no branches and had a flat top. It made for a solid perch to settle upon. It was fairly late, just a few minutes past 7 in the evening, and he had reached the very top of the tree roughly 20 minutes prior. Satsuki, whom he had been silently working alongside, had left to take care of some sort of business an hour beforehand. Though there was definite danger in climbing the trees on his own, he had trusted himself enough to try, and it had paid off. He had effectively conquered the task. He was even able to jog up the tree if need be. Though they had said very little, the competition between himself and Satsuki had been intense and fast-paced. Each time one of them reached a new milestone, the other redoubled their efforts to exceed it. The competition had served as an excellent motivator. Shikamaru probably still whips us both on the trees, but oh well, at least we can do it now, the blonde thought to himself. The Nara had largely been absent throughout the past 3 days, though he had occasionally returned to commune with his teammates. What he did for the majority of the day out on his own, Nar knew not. Knowing him, he's probably just sleeping somewhere. It had explained why he takes so long to get home some days. Nar mused within his mind. He then let his mind begin to wander to more mundane things, such as what he planned to do upon their return to Konoha. There were bills to be paid, groceries to buy, and a sleeping schedule to amend. Though it wasn't exactly exorbitant, the pay the blonde received from completing missions had practically doubled his monthly income. He was now able to buy a survivable amount of food weekly, and he had even bought himself a new shirt. Old habits tended to die hard, however. He still ate quite conservatively, and he still tended to wear his clothes in 2-day increments with washes between each day. Before he could truly immerse himself in the fascinating train of thought regarding what exactly he planned to do about the leaking pipe in his kitchen, the sound of footsteps on a tree near to him caught his attention. Slowly but surely, the person scaling the nearby tree came into view. You made it all the way up here, huh? Not too shabby, came the voice of Satsuki, who carefully perched herself atop her own tree roughly 6 feet from Nar. The blonde eyed her carefully, though they had yet to explode at one another since the incident several nights ago still loomed over every brief exchange of words. Sensing little, if any, animosity from her, Nar allowed himself to calm. It took a while, but yeah, got to say though, it gets cold up here without the trees to block the wind. He replied, silently, regretting the shortness of his shirt sleeves as he spoke. Satsuki cracked a smile and did something odd. She reached behind her back and took hold of some of her hair. She then tossed it over the top of her shoulders on either side, thus covering her arms with her dark hair. I hate how long it is right now, but it can come in handy, she joked. Nar laughed a bit and rested his head on his bent right knee. You'd better cut it pretty short. Somebody might light it on fire one of these days. Could be the end of you, he said in response. Satsuki blew a strand of hair out of her face and shifted in place to improve her balance atop the tree. Try it and I'll break your neck 5 different ways, she said haughtily as the first of many winds came blowing across the treetops. Nar put up his hands in a show of faux concession. Never said it'd be me. Just pointing out what might happen, he replied. The pair then lapsed into a fairly immediate silence that lasted a fair amount of time with each simply observing the dimming sky just above their heads. So, what did you leave to do? The blonde asked to finally end the void. Satsuki glanced at him out of her periphery and gathered herself to respond. I went to ask Kakashi about his sharing. Those eyes are exclusive to my family and anybody else having them is cause for some questioning, she said. Naruto's interest was immediately piqued as similar questions had been cycling through his own mind since the brutal encounter with Zabuza. What did you find out? I was honestly wondering the same thing, he pressed. Satsuki drew her knees up to her chin and chewed on her lower lip absently. He got the eye as a gift from a friend. From what I pieced together, it was a dying gift. Probably sometime during the Third World War if I had to guess. He's around that age, I think, she said, drawing a nod from her teammate. That makes some sense. Giving away an eye is a little weird, but I guess it would be meaningful in that sort of situation. Nar said. The raven-haired girl shook her head and rotated on her tree to face him more directly. You don't get it. A sharing is the greatest gift an uchi can give. It's like giving away a piece of our identity, a piece of who we are. That's why it's not a thing that happens very often. We were a close-knit clan. Most of our friends were our own flesh and blood. She began settling into a cross-legged position as she spoke. The fact that he was even close with an uchi is a little surprising to begin with, and that being willing to give up a sharing to him is just baffling. It's not my place to judge since I wasn't there. But I think you can understand why I felt like asking questions, she concluded. Nar took his time processing the information being presented to him as there was a considerable volume of it to be reviewed. You really miss them, don't you? He asked after a time. Satsuki's eyes drifted away from him into the rapidly setting sun on the horizon. Of course I do. They were my family. What kind of person wouldn't understand? She started, cutting herself off midway through to give him another uncomfortable look. Oh yeah, I always forget with you, she muttered. Naruto let out a hollow chuckle and scratched the back of his head a tad awkwardly. Maybe we should avoid talking about family stuff from here on out. Doesn't seem to do either of us any good when we do, he suggested. Satsuki nodded in agreement and shrugged her shoulders back to return her hair behind her back. Or we could just talk less in general. We always end up at each other's throats, she said with a shrug. Much to the surprise of both of them, Nar shook his head. No, that sounds boring. I like to talk, even if it means having to put up with you, he said. Satsuki raised an eyebrow and folded one of her legs underneath herself to form a makeshift cushion. Shikamaru does exist, you know. You're both boys. You probably have more in common, she pointed out. Nar rolled one of his shoulders to relieve some of the stiffness that had begun to develop in it over time. I get a kick out of him when he's in the mood to joke, but he's usually just dry and matter of fact. Sort of boring, if you ask me, he said simply. The Uchiha girl eyed him strangely. So, you'd rather take verbal beatings and let me get under your skin than deal with somebody being boring, huh? She asked. Naruto laughed a bit. Yeah, I guess so, he said honestly. Satsuki sighed and stood up to stretch her legs and back, which had both grown sore from remaining seated. Well, whatever you're into, she said casually. Though it took him a moment to realize what the comment implied, when he did, Naruto reined and shot to his feet. We both know I didn't mean it like that, he grumbled. In a rare moment of girlishness, Satsuki covered her mouth and giggled at his discomfort. Yeah, sure. Tell me if you ever want to be insulted some more. I can scratch that itch anytime you want. She joked suggestively, drawing an embarrassed scowl from her teammate. You suck, he murmured under his breath as he recomposed herself. The sun then fully passed behind the horizon, leaving the pair in the dead of night atop the forest itself. Both took ample time to admire the finally visible stars overhead. Hey Nar, Satsuki said out of the blue after the splendor of the sky had worn away some. The blonde looked back at her for the first time in several minutes. What's up? Got another one-liner ready? He asked only half-jokingly. The Uchiha girl paid his quip no heed and met his eyes reluctantly. I'm sorry for getting rough with you the other night. I still don't like that you went mouth-to-mouth with me, but you were doing what you thought was necessary. I shouldn't have gotten so nasty about it. She apologized, clearly hating every moment of it as she choked the words out one at a time. Taken aback by her self-awareness, Naruto blinked several times. Oh, don't worry about it. It's fine. People have been worse to me before, he said dismissively, eager to change the topic. The Uchiha girl gestured downward to the far-off forest floor. Dinner's probably on soon. We should head back, she said, seemingly on cue. Naruto's stomach growled, prompting the pair to scale back down to the earth below. They then returned home in only somewhat uncomfortable silence. Haku rubbed a bit of sleep out of her eyes as she tked along through the heavily theseated forest. The night was dark in general, but the trees blocking out the moon certainly didn't aid in her campaign to traverse the trees without breaking her nose in the bark. An inability to sleep consistently had small benefits if one knew how to optimize the ailment. But at present, the pseudo-insomnia served as nothing more than a nuisance to the girl. If days weren't so horribly dull, then maybe I'd be tired enough to pass out. She silently complained. Spending her days in the barracks of God's men was far from ideal, and as such, she took as many chances as she could to wander the nearby forest. The men stared. What few women there were paid her no heed in the entire facility riot of blood and alcohol. The pigs stare even when I wear my mask. Predators, the lot of them, she thought to herself as she hopped over a fallen log reflexively. She had no particular plans in mind in terms of directionality. All she wished to do was walk. As she did so, she allowed her mind to wander back to the objective of hers and Zabuza's presence in the land of waves. The moment negotiations end between Zabuza-sama and that tiny wretch, we get to work. I still find it odd that such a powerful man would go to such lengths to eliminate a single bridge builder, but it matters little, she pondered, ducking under a branch as the thoughts bounced around in her mind. That team of genin has nothing for us, though. Kakashi Hatake certainly poses a threat. I wonder, could the children be leveraged against him? She wondered to herself as she recalled the team she had momentarily glimpsed during the encounter. Her mind returned to another scenario entirely from 3 days prior. To think that a trained shinobi would sleep unguarded in foreign territory is beyond me. I could have slit his throat 8 different ways by the time he noticed me, she mused. Despite her bafflement at the boy she'd encountered lack of concern, she found herself chuckling at the memory. He was fun to tease. Very quick triggers. Quite a sharp boy, too, she thought to herself. She had very much enjoyed her brief encounter with the ninja named Shikamaru, much in contrast to her better judgment. A darker look then eliminated her small laughs and smiles, and hell be dead within a week. A friend made an obituary written, she thought to herself with a long sigh. It was bleak in and of itself that a single, not particularly warm conversation with another person even remotely close to her age had registered as a friendship in Haku's mind, and she knew it. With a shake of her head, she continued on with her aimless walk. As time went on, the presence of a light in the distance ahead of her grew more and more potent. The closer she drew to it, the more of where and what it was she could make out. Slowly but surely, she deduced that the light was streaming out from the window of a house just outside the reach of the forest. Suddenly, feeling quite intrigued, Haku picked up the pace at which she was walking. Within 2 minutes, she emerged from the forest onto the edge of a clearing where the house sat in the center. She then focused her eyes on what laid within the dwelling. When she identified the contents of the house, her eyes widened just a tad. Sitting around what seemed to be a dinner table was the exact same team of ninja she had encountered at the river alongside the bridge builder they had so fiercely defended. So this is where they went. I figured they had to be nearby. She thought to herself with assessing eyes. The longer she looked, the more she came to realize just how golden an opportunity she had stumbled upon purely by chance. I could clean this up right here and now. It would only take a few moments, she thought to herself. There was a simple, clear line of sight at the bridge builder's neck, and the window was a crack open. She possessed a level of accuracy well beyond what would have been required to make the shot count. Reaching into a small pocket on the side of her sundress, Haku produced a pair of sunbee needles. Sit still, would you? She muttered as the old man shifted around in his seat while speaking to the others at the table. Eventually, the bridge builder settled into place with his neck still easily exposed. Checkmate. Haku whispered, rearing her arm back to complete the task that had randomly fallen into her lap. Just as she began to perform the killing motion to throw the sunbee, however, a familiar face and neck obstructed her target. Shikamaru had leaned across the table to retrieve something. His sudden appearance in her line of sight caused Haku to flinch. As such, when she threw the first needle, her aim was jerkish and altered. With a surprisingly loud clicking sound, her sunbon bounced off the window, instantly drawing the attention of those within the house. Luckily for her, Haku still dwelled just within the shadow of the forest, thus rendering her effectively invisible from such a distance. There goes my chance, she thought to herself as the ninja within the house blindly stared in her direction. Well aware that it would be known to her only, Haku locked eyes with Shikamaru, who had been responsible for ruining her aim. Troublesome boy of all the times, she grumbled within her mind, though she couldn't find it within herself to conjure up any real disdain. With a shake of her head, Haku turned her back to the house and slinkicked back into the forest once again. Unbeknownst to her, while all the rest had returned to their dinner, Shikamaru's eyes were still firmly locked in her direction as she walked away. 2 slight gleams of light shone themselves distinctly among the grass. The morning sky was dull and overcast, and it was hardly past dawn. All that allowed for the reflection at all was what little sunlight could find its way through the clouds and fog of the morning dew. Despite the minority of the flashes of light, Shikamaru kept his eyes fixed on them and approached with all the conviction of a drunkard fresh off a poor night out. He was extremely tired, and much of it was attributable to the fact that he had slept a mere 2 hours that night. The reasoning behind his inability to get much rest at all was laying right before his feet, right where the reflections of the dull light had come from. A pair of combat needles, known properly as espan, laid a few inches from one another, just below the front window, the humble house of Suna and his family. At the sight of them, every suspicion that had been nagging at his psyche since the battle upon the river snapped into frame. The same weapon that sent Zabuza down, thrown right at our window. What a coincidence, the Nar thought to himself as he knelt down to pluck the needles from the blades of grass. The moment he touched them, he recoiled slightly. They were unbelievably cold. The night had certainly been chilly, but the needles themselves were far below a freezing point. Approaching more gingerly this time, Shikamaru carefully picked up one of the needles using as little skin as possible. It was razor sharp and roughly 6 in long, just enough length to pierce a person through the broad side of their neck. So, I was right. There was somebody nearby last night. I think I caught the sound of their footsteps, too. Shikamaru thought to himself, a slight chill running down his spine. Silent as a cemetery, quick as a flash of lightning, there had been an assassination attempt right under their noses. It was an unsettling proposition to grapple with. Even Kakashi had been unaware of it as far as Shikamaru could tell. As he sorted his emotions, a face flashed across his mind's eye. A face with brown eyes, fair skin, an odd smile, and long brown hair. The girl, who was apparently named Haku. The needles themselves provided no more of a case against her, not in any logical sense, but for reasons unknown to even himself, Shikamaru found his skepticism of her growing ever strong. I've met her literally once. The voice is all I have to work with. Other than that, I'm grasping at straws, he thought to himself. He then shook his head and rubbed the remaining sleep from his weary eyes. Turning toward the forest that spread out for miles beyond the house. He took a step forward. Walks were an excellent way to cleanse oneself of uncertainty and stress, both of which were plaguing him. I've got a hunch that I know where you are, he muttered under his breath. And so he briskly entered the forest. Though he had originally intended to keep his pace rapid, he quickly found that he was too tired to do so. Slowing down to his usual lethargic shuffle, Shikamaru took a deep breath and held it for a moment before releasing it. It's probably a terrible idea for me to be out on my own, given what those needles mean, but oh well, he mused with a dry chuckle. Fear for his own mortality was a sentiment that had crossed his mind a number of times in recent memory, but there was no room for it in the thick of things. As the sticks and leaves crunched under his feet, the Nar felt some of his nerves dissipate, though he had largely dismissed it for most of his life. Nature and its contents truly did have a serenity about it. A sort of energy that could soothe a person. Still prefer clouds, but I don't mind this, he thought to himself as he traversed the forest slowly, taking time to study the trees and animals. The ground was fairly damp from the morning dew, though nowhere near as swampish as it had been after the storm several days prior. Such variance in weather spoke to a healthy ecosystem. I should take walks more often. Would help with my cardio, he joked to himself. A rustling sound then caught his attention. Taking his eyes away from his surroundings to focus on the path directly ahead of him, he spotted the source of the noise. It was a deer and a fairly large one at that. A male deer, huh? Not often you see one of those out and about, Shikamaru thought to himself as he assessed the antlers protruding from the deer's head. The animal hardly felt or looked aggressive. As with most roaming beasts, it merely looked apprehensive. Go on, take your time. The Nar called lightly to the deer. For a time, it simply stared at the genin with wide eyes. Eventually, it scampered off into a nearby brush, its footsteps growing fainter and fainter as it lengthened the distance between them. Once the deer was gone, Shikamaru cracked a smile and continued on his way. He knew deer well and found them to be better company than people depending on his mood. He encountered no more over the next 5 minutes of travel, though he did catch sight of an owl along the way. Despite how slow his pace was and how aimlessly he let his gaze wander, he did have a destination in mind, though one that hardly held any weight beyond a gut feeling. It was a fair distance from the house, nearly 3 miles in total. Though the length of the trip was a few steps off from ideal, it certainly did give Shikamaru time to think. What do I even want to say if I'm lucky enough to be right about this? I can't exactly lead with the question or even pose it at all, he pondered. Information gathering was an active part of being a ninja, but truth be told, Shikamaru had never even attempted it before in any non-casual setting. Beyond this, he had virtually no clue what he was up against intellectually. Haku had let very little slip about her personality, aside from an apparent enjoyment of plant life and a generally humorous demeanor. Either she did that on purpose, or it had everything to do with time and place. No way to tell which, he thought to himself. He was far from used to giving another person so much thought, especially one that he knew practically nothing about beyond a name and face. Shelving the train of thought for the moment, Shikamaru focused his energy on navigation. Given several minutes and another odd encounter with a smaller deer, the Naro reached the edge of where he had intended to be. A clearing of various exotic ill-looking flowers and other types of plants. Its colorful appearance and bright colors stood out starkly amongst the dull palette of green and brown all around it. Something else stuck out, even among the flowers and greenery. A person, and exactly who Shikamaru had hoped to find. For one reason or another, Haku was sitting cross-legged in the far left corner of the small clearing with a basket at her side. She appeared to be eating something small, as evidenced by the fact that she was chewing. I found a pretty girl sitting in a field of flowers. This is so damn cliché, Shikamaru thought to himself as he observed her from just behind the concealing brush. She was wearing a similar sundress to the one she had been during their first encounter, and she appeared to be quite content. The longer he studied her, the less sure of his suspicions he became. There's no way this chick killed Zabuza. There's a literal butterfly sitting on her head, and she hasn't touched it, he thought to himself. Before he could fall any further down into his doubts, he was snapped back to attention. You're free to step into the open anytime you like. Just don't think you're hidden, Haku called, not changing her posture or the direction of her gaze at all as she spoke. Flinching slightly, Shikamaru reluctantly stepped through into the clearing. Once he was fully exposed, Haku finally addressed him directly with her eyes. If I didn't know better, I'd think that you came looking for me, she said calmly. Her expression was difficult to read. She certainly didn't look irritated or particularly bothered in general by his arrival, but it was equally difficult to suss out any true positivity from her features. The Nar shook his head and absently scratched his cheek, which had been grazed by a leaf on his way out. Just looking for a place to sleep, sort of loud back at home base, he replied. Haku tilted her head off to one side and reached into her basket. She produced a small piece of white bread, which she promptly popped into her mouth. If that's the case, then why were you staring at me through the bushes? She inquired innocently upon finishing chewing. Shikamaru's left eye twitched at the question. I'll never get used to seeing random people deep in the forest. Not my fault you have weird habits. He shot back defensively. Haku straightened her posture and rested her hands in her lap. Which do you find more strange? A girl enjoying flowers and picnics, or a boy taking his sweet time looking her up and down from the shadows? She asked while locking eyes with him. The Nar snorted and folded his arms across his chest. You say that like you're even worth staring at, he said bluntly. Haku shrugged her shoulders and kept her gaze fixed on him quizzically. Well, you certainly don't seem to mind doing so. Posturing aside, you're free to pass through to find your resting place. I won't stop you, she said simply. When Shikamaru didn't move more than a step or two forward, she gestured to the ground near her. Well, if you're going to stay, at least take a seat and talk. No need to make things more awkward than they need to be, she suggested. After a few moments of resistance, the Nar did as he was told and sat himself down roughly 10 feet from Haku. I'm guessing you spend most of your time out here, he asked as an opener. The girl shook her head, much to his surprise. She then took another bite of bread. I'm quite a busy person, actually. These little adventures out in the woods are how I reward myself. I'm sure you can relate given your profession, she replied. Shikamaru mentally noted her wording and glanced up at the gray sky peeking through the treetops. I guess I like to watch clouds a bit just to clear my head sometimes. I'm new to this whole ninja thing, he said. Honestly, it made him somewhat uncomfortable to reveal his own personal interests and hobbies to somebody he knew so scarcely. But for the ends of confirming or denying his suspicions, building a foundation of rapport was necessary. Haku touched her bottom lip with her index finger. You're new, H. You struck me as quite experienced a few days ago, though you were quite young, so it does make sense, she said thoughtfully. She then turned her eyes up to the sky and frowned. I can't really say that I understand why cloud watching would be fun or interesting. It's just the sky. It never changes, she said. The Nara shook his head and joined her in watching the bleak cosmos overhead. You're just looking at it the wrong way. It changes a ton day to day. Sometimes it's a different shade. The lineup of clouds changes a bunch, too. No one's sky is the same, he said. Haku looked back to him from the clouds and reached into her basket. That's an interesting way to look at it. It seems a bit nitpicky to me, though, she said. Shikamaru met her odd gaze and shifted in place to make himself more comfortable. Anybody with any sort of awareness is going to think life is boring, so you need to look for the little things. If you think too narrowly, then people, places, days, it'll all blend into a flavorless soup, he reasoned. The girl gave a humorous smile and tossed him a piece of the bread she had been nibbling on. That's an odd analogy and I don't know how much I agree with you, but whatever works to keep you lively. People can be put into boxes once you meet enough of them. Environment, upbringing, money, it all molds people. Take people from the same social groups, monetary statuses, and places, and you're bound to find that they're all painfully similar, she countered. The Nar raised an eyebrow and fiddled with the bread pensively. You must live a pretty dull life if you really think that, he said directly. Hiku swept her hair over shoulders to let it hang over her front. Oh, I get plenty of excitement out of my days. Too much for my liking and not really the type I'd like to be partaking in, she said lightly. Shikamaru raised an eyebrow and passed the bread from one hand to the other several times. I could take that a few different ways, but that aside, what's a simple village girl going to run into often enough to tire her out? Genuinely curious, he said. For the briefest of moments, Haku's composure cracked in the form of her lips twitching at their edges. A frown nearly formed, but she pulled her mouth back into a thin line before it could. We come from different places. My obligations are different than yours. You travel and carry out tasks, and I do chores and keep things in order, she said calmly. Finally, Shikamaru took a bite of the bread he had been given and chewed it before swallowing. Got to say, for a rural native, you speak more clearly than most of my instructors back at the academy. Where do you even get an education way out here? He pressed skeptically. Hiku leaned her face on her palm and blew a strand of hair from her eyes. My father is quite a smart man. Doesn't always show it, though he can be quite crude. He taught me most of what I know, she replied automatically. Shikamaru nodded and finished the last of the bread he'd been given. He then chose to shift his tactics, not to change the topic, but honestly, half the reason I'm out here is to get away from the house. We had somebody take a shot at us last night. They tried to get rid of one of us, he said, curious to see Haku's reaction to the vague information. What he got in response was far from what he had expected. Haku's eyes widened, her expression shifted to one of concern, and she leaned forward over her knees. Really? That's horrible. Was anybody injured? She asked. Shikamaru recoiled just a tad at her sudden invisible concern. In particular, her wide, dark brown eyes dug into him with a force that froze him momentarily. No, they missed the shot they took. We're all good, he said a touch awkwardly. Hiku sighed and relaxed, folding her hands over her chest as she settled once again. Well, that's good to hear. If this assassin is incompetent enough to fail a task, then perhaps my home isn't in much danger, she said in a relieved tone. Shikamaru resolidified his posture and draped an arm over his bent knee. Yeah, you're probably safe. Assassins don't really mass target. If you're just a resident, they'll leave you alone. No worries, he said in an odd tone. Hiku then stood up and stretched her arms over her head. Good to know. Now then, since you're here, I'd like your help. I'd like to gather 150 lilies. There should be more than that many here, but picking them alone would be a hassle, she said, beckoning him to his feet as she spoke. Shikamaru obliged and rose to meet her. And why should I help you? Sounds like a drag to me, he asked. Hiku smiled and clasped her hands down by her waist as a breeze blew across the clearing. Because it would be very polite, and I may reward you if you do, she said in response. Sensing that arguing would be a pointless endeavor, the Narsidan did as he was told. Hiku soon joined in a kneel on the ground to search for the lilies she had requested to be picked. They then commenced their search. As they picked and gathered the specific flower, Shikamaru glanced at the girl scourging only feet from him. She appeared genuinely pleased with the activity they were partaking in. Her lips were pulled into an easy smile, her features were relaxed, and she was enthusiastically searching for the lilies. At the sight, Shikamaru exhaled through his nose and returned his eyes to the ground. I read this wrong. I had to have, she's a normal girl, he thought to himself, unsure of himself on every level. As he pondered these things, unbeknownst to him, Hiku gazed at him with a triumphant smile. Kakashi glanced around the living room of Suna's home to assess the looks and emotions of the remainder of Team 7. Shikamaru, who had been absent for the entirety of the morning, had returned only minutes ago, and the first thing he had done was call for a gathering. The Nar was hardly one to enjoy group activities and tended to strike out on his own when he could. With this in mind, it stood to reason that he had something fairly important to say. Could you speed this up? I want to eat breakfast. Nar complained, earning an elbow to the ribs from Satsuki that caused him to glare at her. Before the pair could predictably begin arguing, Shikamaru heeded Naruto's request and spoke up. Save your fighting for a few minutes from now. You're going to want to hear this. Trust me, he said seriously, regaining the attention of the uchiha and uzumaki. Kakashi himself leaned forward in his seat and awaited the follow-up. The Nar then took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. He then produced a pair of sunbeam needles, which he promptly set on the table that laid in the center of the living room. I found those just outside the kitchen window. I think we all remember the weird clicking sound that we heard during dinner against the glass. Well, I've got a strong feeling that these are what caused it, he began, allowing the rest of his team to piece together his logic themselves. What exactly are you suggesting, Shikamaru? I've got a solid idea that I know, but I'd still like to hear what you have to say. Kakashi said after a time, drawing nods of agreement from Naruto and Satsuki. Shikamaru jammed a thumb at Suna, who was silently sitting in a chair in the rightmost corner. Somebody was out to kill him. Based on where he was sitting relative to the window, the person who threw those sunbon was aiming for his neck, he said, taking a deep breath to continue on. And the obvious kicker is that the exact weapon that took out Zabuza was Sanbon. I've been skeptical of that whole sequence since it happened. To be honest, it's just too convenient. The moment Zabuza is being overwhelmed, somebody else swoops in to kill him instead. I didn't quite know what I thought of it until I found those sunbon, he said. Satsuki then spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. Are you saying that? She started. Before she could finish, Shikamaru cut him off with a curt nod and a sweeping look around the room to make sure that all attention was on him and his words. Yeah, you've got it. Zabuza is alive and that Hunter is working with him to put Suna in an early grave. Haku stared up at the ceiling of the barracks, silently as the usual noise and chaos of the people around her slowly died down and succumbed to the dark of the night. For as offensively loud as it was during the day, God's barracks did tend to be somewhat bearable at night. Criminals and freaks though they were, the men he employed were still human. They needed rest just as much as the next person. You spent almost all of today out and about. Did you find anything worth using? Came the voice of Zabuza from Haku's left. The man had long been her caretaker of sorts, though their bond was less familiar than a partnership of business and convenience. To Zabuza, anyway, Haku had long considered the violent man to be more akin to a guardian figure than a mere master. No, not really. These parts are barren, save for a few settlements, she replied, drawing a nod from the rogue swordsman leaned against the wall nearby. Zabuza then eyed her curiously. You went to the woods again, didn't you? He asked. Haku initially prepared to tell a white lie of sorts, but soon decided against it in favor of honesty. I did. Yes. Quite a nice place for such a dull country, she said. Zabuza rubbed the side of his neck, which was still bandaged from the non-fatal puncture wound that Haku herself had inflicted. That explains the huge flower display just outside the compound. Why do you even waste your time with that sort of thing? He asked tiredly. Haku fiddled with a stray sunbon for a few moments. Because flowers are beautiful and they make me happy, I wouldn't mind being a gardener one day, she said. Zabuza snorted and began to audibly sharpen his large blade with the edge of a much smaller canny. Don't get your hopes up, kid. You'll probably be dead before you get the chance to strike out on your own, he said bluntly. The huntress sighed and rolled onto her stomach. I know, but a girl can hope, she muttered. The rogue swordsman glanced at her from his higher vantage point and kicked aside a small bit of metallic dust at his feet. Women, I'll never understand them. Flowers and plants will always be around. Why care about them? Respect and reputation make a person worthwhile. Focus on those things instead, he said. Haku rolled back onto her back and folded her hands behind her head. If you wanted a partner who agrees with you on that, you should have found a boy. Zabuzu-sama. I'll stick to my plants for an outlet. Not that I won't do my job as always, because I will, she said. When Zabuza didn't immediately respond, Haku closed her eyes and let her mind wander back to other things. Picking lies was pleasant. Not the nicest day weather-wise, but that was certainly a highlight, she reviewed within her mind. The face of the person with whom she'd gathered the flowers then returned to her, drawing a slight smile. I'm surprised he actually stuck around and helped me. I couldn't have stopped him from leaving while keeping up my facade. I'm glad he did, though. He's good company, she thought fondly. A chuckle then escaped her. He's razor sharp and a stickler for details. He noticed every single one of the small holes I left in my story, and he subtly attacked each of them. His blank face certainly hides his smarts quite well, she recalled. She then caught a pestering fly between her middle and index finger, crushing it soon after. And he's exploitable emotionally. All I had to do to trip him up was lay it on thick with my concern. He doubted himself instantly. He's brilliant, but he's immature. She thought to herself. Something specific Shikamaru had said then crossed her conscience. You're just looking at it the wrong way. It changes a ton day to day. Sometimes it's a different shade. The lineup of clouds changes a bunch too. No one's sky is the same. Is that the way you view the world? Shikimaru with the mindset that each thing is unique, even if only in a small way. You're so naive, it's almost cute, she pondered. She then rolled onto her side and gently pulled a lily she had saved from her original project out of the pocket of her hunter's uniform. As she gazed at it, she sighed heavily. Or maybe you think that way to keep yourself sane. We all have our coping mechanisms. Perhaps yours is just more productive than mine, she thought to herself. She then began to feel her consciousness fading away under the weight of her exhaustion. As the sleep moved to claim her, she formed one final thought. It won't be long before it all comes crashing down, but before then, I'll find him again. Just for the fun of it, Nar glanced to either side of himself to gauge the emotions of his fellow genin. All three were seated in a row across the couch of Suna's living room and had been for several minutes waiting for Kakashi's exit from the nearby shower. They were all well aware of what was bound to be discussed, and each of them dreaded it for different reasons. For Naruto himself, it was the reality that they would almost certainly be encountering Zabuza once more. Helplessness was an unpleasant thing. For Satsuki, though she veiled her emotions far more carefully, it was clear to all who knew her even somewhat that she despised the notion of being forced to rely on those around her for assistance again, especially after having been unceremoniously saved from drowning by Nar. Shikamaru's fears were less clear in origin, but they likely pertained to similar things as Nar, a feeling of complete and utter uselessness in the face of danger. It was hardly any of their faults. They were a group of green, inexperienced children in an incredibly adult situation. Genin were not expected to contend with such intense levels of raw strength, misdirection, and deception, and especially not all at once. Such tasks were generally reserved for Chunin and seasoned ones at that. For the first time since their promotion to Genin, Team 7 fully appreciated the caution Heron exercised in regards to assigning anything beyond mundane cleanup work. Many conversations had begun, stagnated and fizzled out in their time on the couch. Unbearable as the silence was, there wasn't much to be said. Finally, after a nearly rage-inducing stretch of 15 minutes, Kakashi emerged from the leftmost hall wearing shorts, a tank top, and his usual mask. He also had a towel draped across his shoulders. Taking a seat on the chair just across from the couch, the Jonin cracked his stiff neck and cleared his throat to snap the genin from their boredom-induced trance. Forgive the wait. I had just as much thinking to do as all of you. Now, we're just going to jump right into it. After giving what Shikamaru theorized some hard thought, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think he's spot on. He said as a lead, an uncomfortable shift worked through the group of genin. The evidence is overwhelming, and I'm not going to take any chances about this. You're sitting here right now to listen, so keep your mouths shut for the next little while. I'm going to go over who's doing what when we bring Tuna to the bridge, he said. All three teens nodded and awaited instruction. Kakashi then folded his arms across his chest. The primary objective is to keep Suna alive. All else comes second to that goal. As such, the three of you are going to keep a similar formation to the one we used on the way here. Unlike before, though, you're going to be much closer to him, he started. When he was sure that his word had been fully processed by the genin before him, he continued speaking. The big wild card is whether or not the hunter shows up. Zabuza is a given, and I'm more than ready to shut down his water clones this time around. But if he has help, the three of you are probably going to have to deal with the hunter yourselves, he said. Nar raised his hand in response. If that hunter was able to knock Zabuza out of action, what the hell are we supposed to do? We couldn't even handle a pair of weak clones, he pointed out. Shikamaru shook his head and sat up a bit straighter. If the hunter was working with him, then Zabuza probably didn't bother defending himself when the needles went through him. We have no real way to know how strong this hunter is. It'd be better to assume that we can take them just for the sake of confidence, he corrected. Kakashi nodded and unfolded his arms. Exactly. I'm just as in the dark about that aspect of things as you are. If the hunter arrives, then Satsuki is going to be the first to engage them. She's the strongest and should act as a solid measuring stick, he said, causing Naruto to grumble something under his breath that largely went unheard. What happens if we manage to kill them? Do we step in to help you with Zabuza? She asked. The Jonin shook his head firmly and pointed to each of the genin. Under no circumstances or any of you to even think about intervening. Zabuza is mine and mine only. He'd kill all three of you before you could even take a breath, he said seriously. Before any of the ninja could say any more, footsteps behind the couch caught their attention. Dinner is on, folks. Tuna, who was peering in from the kitchen, said. Kakashi nodded and looked back to his team. You know all that you need to stay in formation and be cautious. Don't do anything rash and you should be fine, he said. Shikamaru and Kakashi then rose to their feet and exited the living room, leaving only Satsuki and Nar, who were both fairly deep in their own thoughts. Eventually, after a minute or two, Nar stood up as well and began to walk away toward the kitchen. Before he could exit the room, however, he was stopped in his tracks. Do you think we're going to die, Nar? The call had come from Satsuki, who was still seated on the couch with her legs folded over one another. Her tone was far from fearful, but it was hardly confident. It sounded numb. The blonde glanced back over his shoulder and considered his answer for several moments before replying. Probably not. Can't say why I think that, but I just don't feel like it's our time yet, he said. Honestly, the girl chewed her bottom lip absently and stood up with a stretch of her back, which cracked several times. The odds don't seem to be on our side, but I appreciate the optimism, even if it's a bit vague. I'd better make it through this. I've got things I need to do, places I need to go, she said. Naruto shrugged and leaned against the wall near the door frame to face her more directly. Yeah, well, so do I. Being Hokage sort of requires me to be alive, as dumb as it is, he joked, earning a rare laugh from his usually prickly teammate. Satsuki's features then took on a darker tone as she pondered something. Her gaze then returned to Naruto for a moment. And I can't kill a man from beyond the grave. Inconvenient as that is, she said, reiterating Naruto's words to fit her own much more unsettling thoughts. The blonde internally shuddered a bit as he recalled the first gathering of Team 7 atop the academy roof. There's somebody I'm going to kill, somebody I need to get rid of. I'll be seeing that through. Sooner or later, I'll have a body at my feet. He had somewhat forgotten Satsuki's disturbing declaration until the present moment. And now that he had been reminded, he found her steady stare in his direction more than a bit discomforting. Nodding reluctantly, Nar scratched the back of his head. Why, yeah, you definitely need to be alive for that, he said with an awkward laugh. The raven-haired girl chuckled and began walking in his direction. As she passed him to enter the kitchen, she gave his forehead a light flick with her nails without even a glance in his direction. The gesture caused Naruto to flinch. What the hell was that all about? He wondered to himself as the spot on his forehead that her nails had grazed stung a bit. Shaking his head in resignation to the confusion, he rounded the corner to join the remainder of his team at the table. The meal was nearly silent as each person had their own reservations to ponder. Satsuki wiped sweat from her brow as she laid flat on her back on the futon that had been provided to her. Despite the fairly moderate temperature outdoors, the interior of Suna's home had a tendency to grow oppressively hot at night. It made blankets entirely unnecessary and perhaps even unadvisable. Exhaling through her nose, the uchiha girl tugged at the collar of her cotton pajamas to remedy the heat even slightly. I should have just brought a nightgown. This is horrible, she thought to herself in the humidity and heat. Cotton was a comfortable material to sleep in most of the time, but not when it was practically a convection oven indoors. Opting to take her thoughts to places other than the exorbitant amount of sweat dripping down her body, Satsuki returned herself to the gathering that had occurred roughly 2 hours prior. Not even Kakashi is sure of what's going to happen. We leave for the bridge tomorrow morning and we still only have half of a plan. If that, she thought to herself. It was a grim proposition with a massive pool of evidence to suggest that Zabuza was still alive. There was absolutely no reason to believe that the next day would be anything but hellish. Combat, blood, and adrenaline. That was what awaited them. None of which was healthy in extreme doses. If we're lucky, we'll just end up sitting back and watching Kakashi deal with Zabuza. But I have a strong feeling that this hunter is going to show up. If that happens, it falls to me. She pondered. To be the first one the front lines when push came to shove was a burden to be sure and one that she very much wished she could welcome. But in the back of her mind, doubts nagged at her relentlessly. Even if you'd come sooner, there's nothing you could have done, foolish sister. The repressed memory sent a jolt through Satsuki, causing her to drag her hand over her face to cover her eyes as she forcibly pushed it back down. Unlike her most recent relapse before the mirror in her bathroom, she managed to regain herself before any images could sweep across her mind's eye. Despite the lack of visuals, the emotions remained the same. When have I ever protected somebody? She questioned within her mind with her eyes still veiled by her slightly shaking hand. She quickly recalled her team's encounter with the demon brothers during their trek to the land of waves in which she had prevented Naruto from being decapitated. Though she initially drew solace from the knowledge that she had succeeded in saving a life, she quickly tore it down. Kakashi is the only reason we weren't torn to pieces. I would have been worthless against them. Next time out, Naruto had to get physical with me to make sure I didn't drown, she admitted to herself. Her grip on her temples then tightened. What makes you qualified to hold their lives in your hands? If you can't do it, then neither can they, and you were just as helpless as they were last time out, she reprimanded herself. Then, in spite of a Herculean effort to stop them, the images of the night she had so long been tormented by flooded back. You've never protected a damn thing. You can't, she hissed aloud in a moment of bitter self-loathing. The world was far larger than she'd ever considered. And along with that scale came giants the magnitude of which Satsuki had no way to contend with. Not as she was, she badly needed to grow stronger, and she hadn't the time to do so before the morning would come. For the first time in years, she was well and truly afraid. She despised it utterly. Just a little girl in over her head again, just like before, she thought to herself in a state of resigned frustration. Before she could sink any deeper into her own negativity, a knock came at her door. Unveiling her eyes, which had been clamped shut, Satsuki spoke. I'm tired, so make it quick, she called out somewhat hoarsely. The door then slid open just enough to reveal the person on the other side. It was Nar, who also looked quite tired. Shikamaru went out again, not sure why, but I'm starting to get a little worried. Wanted to know if you wanted to come with, he explained. Satsuki stared at him through her hazed vision for several moments. The light streaming in from behind him was straining, but it was a welcome escape from the dark of her lampless room. I'll pass. I need to sleep, she replied after a time. The blonde nodded and pulled up the light jacket he was wearing over his shoulders a bit more. I figured, just wanted to ask. I'll try not to wake you up on the way back in, he said before quietly sliding her door shut and audibly exiting the house a moment later. As the silence set back in around her, Satsuki found a new emotion to latch onto and held fast to it. With all the mental strength she had remaining, she forcibly banished her bitterness for the time being. I'll protect them this time, no matter what it costs me. Haku smiled to herself as she meandered about in the region of the forest she had more or less claimed as her territory in her short time inhabiting the land of waves. There were plenty of clearings, a wealth of flowers, and it tended to stay relatively dry. The night was pleasantly warm without being overly stuffy, and for once the moon was peeking its way through the treetops. What a lovely night, she thought to herself contentedly. A firefly then skittered past her face, drawing a wider grin from the girl. She had scarcely encountered the insect before, but she had read plenty about it in an encyclopedia she had stolen from a library in her travels several years prior. She then began to lightly jog after the firefly in an attempt to catch it. She knew it was largely a futile effort, but that fact did not alter the level of entertainment she drew from the activity. Oh, come here you. She whined aloud as the firefly retreated higher above her head. With one final jump, Haku swiped at the bug. Much to her delight, she was able to trap the firefly in her cupped hands. You certainly made me work for it. She scolded the firefly as it frantically flashed and flew about in her hands. Eventually, after several minutes of fondly studying the small creature, Haku opened her hands and released it to the sky above. As its flash faded away to the night, she let out a sigh. So beautiful, she breathed to herself. She had long been enamored by nature for its sheer innocence. Nature knew no true evil, only instinct and innocence, the purest of truths, chasing fireflies. What are you, a dog? Haku immediately scanned her surroundings to locate the origin of the voice. She quickly found it in plain sight, a few meters directly in front of her. Upon identifying the owner, she relaxed somewhat, watching me again. What are you, a stalker? She shot back at Shikamaru, who stood leaned up against a nearby tree. The Naru shrugged his shoulders and returned his weight to his front foot before stepping away from the tree. I was relaxing here first, actually. You just so happened to come wandering by. It made for a good show, he said jokingly. Haku rolled her eyes and snapped a stick under her foot. Did you come looking for me? Be honest, she asked directly. Much to her own surprise, when the genin shook his head, Haku found that she was more than a bit disappointed. Not really. I just like my walks, he said, drawing a somewhat dejected nod from Haku. He then spoke again a half-beat later. But finding you out here isn't really a bad thing. You're a decent talker, he added. The girl smiled and turned her gaze up to the moon. You chose a good night to walk. It's very pretty. The stars especially, she said. Shikamaru took a glance up at the sky and rubbed one of his eyes to clear whatever was plaguing it away. It's a little clear for my liking. I'm not a huge stargazer. Clouds are more interesting to look at. They change more, he said. Haku shook her head and continued to admire the open sky through the gap in the trees. The fact that the stars and constellations never change is exactly why I love them. I can rely on them to always be there, ever still, she said. Shikamaru chuckled a bit. Some poet you are, he said humorously. Haku closed her eyes as a wind blew across the forest and set leaves up around them. Consistency is a luxury I've never had for one reason or another. Call me melodramatic, but the sky has been my closest friend for about as long as I can remember, she said openly. The Nar furrowed his brow and studied her silently for a few seconds. You said earlier that you have a father. Aren't you close to him? He asked skeptically. Haku opened her eyes once more and lowered them to the ground. A slight look of reminiscent melancholy then crossed her features. I'm not his biological daughter. He was kind enough to save me from the life of an orphan, and he taught me how to live. But beyond that, I've never been sure of whether or not he actually cares for me. He can be quite cold, she said. It was the closest thing to genuine honesty she could manage while still maintaining her false identity. She then looked back up to Shikamaru, who wore a fairly ambiguous expression. Fathers can be a little bit detached sometimes. I know mine can be. I don't know yours and probably never will, but I doubt he doesn't care if he took the trouble to adopt you. Haku, he said a tad more gently than he normally intimated. A pang of guilt then rang through the girl's chest. Oh, you'll know Zabuza-sama well. Better than you'd like to, she thought to herself darkly. Shelving the depressing through, Haku allowed herself to take a bit of comfort from his words. Thinking it better to keep her gratitude to herself for the time being, she focused on a more minor aspect of his response. That's the first time you've said my name, she commented. Shikamaru blinked at the revelation and scratched the back of his head. Did I say it right? Seems pretty easy to me, but you never know, he asked. Haku nodded and brushed a few scraps of leaf from her sundress to return it to its flawless state. Yes, perfectly. It's only 2 syllables, so I'd be concerned if you didn't get it right on your first try. Yours is much more difficult. 4 entire syllables, she teased casually. Shikamaru glanced away from her. It's family tradition. All of the men have the same prefix in their name, he said defensively. Haku giggled at his discomfort and took in the scent of the forest. What about the women? She asked. Shikamaru shrugged his shoulders and looked back at her once again. Same thing, but we don't really produce many women. Most children born from us are male. Not sure why, but that's how it is, he said. Haku tilted her head off to one side coyly. I'm surprised you produce enough children to have a reliable statistic on gender. If the men are all like you, then I find it hard to believe that they're decisive enough to get married, she said jabbingly. It was a harsher joke than her previous tickling remarks, but the genin had proven himself to be thick-skinned. Yeah, well, getting married sounds like a lot of work anyway. Besides, women tire me the hell out. They always make me do stuff, he grumbled. Haku raised an eyebrow. Do I tire you out? I've tried quite hard to be polite, she asked. Shikamaru eyed her boredly and assessed her momentarily. You definitely would given time. You made me sit around and pick flowers with you for a whole hour. I only did it because you said there'd be a reward, and all I got was 3 slices of bread, he said bluntly. Haku gave a fake pout. It was good bread. I baked it myself. You're cruel. She whined, drawing a roll of Shikamaru's eyes in response. Sure you did. Tasted store-bought to me. That aside, the flower picking was definitely exhausting, he said. Haku considered a number of responses. I may as well have as much fun as I can. Time is short. I can feel it, she thought to herself. A smirk then crossed her lips as she took several steps forward. What kind of reward were you expecting? Something more interesting? She inquired as she drew closer. Shikamaru gave her an uncomfortable look. No, just something better than bread, he said. Haku raised an eyebrow and kept her eyes fixed on him as she soaked up his obvious unease. That could be a lot of things, Shikamaru. Would you mind elaborating for me? She asked innocently when he didn't respond within a reasonable frame of time. Haku stepped forward one more time. Are you too embarrassed to admit what was on your mind? How improper of you, thinking such things of an innocent, defenseless girl like me, she scolded him. The Nar reeled and stumbled back a step. Back off. My mind wasn't in the gutter. He countered. At his stumble and weak retort, Haku burst out, laughing with more force than she was used to. After taking a few moments to recover while leaning on a tree to keep her balance, Haku flopped to her back. Forgive me, that was mean. I just had to push your buttons a little. I haven't laughed that hard in a long time. She apologized between leftover giggles. Shikamaru sighed tiredly and looked down at her. You suck. You know that, he said. Haku grinned and hopped back to her feet, caring not one bit about the leaves and twigs caught in her hair from her unceremonious fall to the forest floor. Maybe, but I got a kick out of it, so I don't care. You're so prickly. It's adorable, she said without a care in the world. Shikamaru slid his hands into his pockets. Yeah, and you snort when you laugh, he said, drawing a look of embarrassment from the girl. Haku patted her cheeks to suppress their rising heat. Don't mock what I can't control, she mumbled. Shikamaru put his hands up in a gesture of faux defensiveness. You reap what you sow. I'm not just going to roll over and let you make fun of me, he said calmly. Haku sighed and nodded in agreement. I suppose that's fair, she admitted. She then looked back up at the moon, which seemed to have grown a bit brighter over time. How long has it been since I've felt this stressless? I can't recall another time, she pondered silently, pushing away the thoughts of what was to come. Haku let herself enjoy the feeling despite the knowledge that it would soon go up in flames. Hey, Haku, came the voice of Shikamaru, bringing her eyes down from the sky. The girl met his gaze curiously and gestured for him to continue. I know this will sound weird coming from me, but thanks for this. I know I've complained a bunch, but screwing around with you out here has honestly been a great distraction from what I'm really here to do, the genin said candidly. His face then contorted into a look of apprehension. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but my team and I are set to start our main mission tomorrow, and well, we almost got killed a few days back for trying the same thing. It's been weighing on me. The idea that I could die soon, I mean, he said honestly. Haku fought the urge to cover her mouth. Shikamaru then chuckled dryly. But hey, what can you do? It's part of the job. At least I can say I died honorably or whatever. Or maybe it won't come to that. There's no way to know for sure, but either way, this is probably the last you'll see of me, he continued. Then finally, he smiled. So, thank you. You made this trip a little easier for me. I appreciate it. You're a cool person, he concluded. Against the voice of reason, screaming at her from every corner of her mind, Haku did as her emotions instructed. She reached out and practically fell forward. Within the next moment, she was tightly wrapped around his abdomen with her arms tangled behind his back. Hey, what's your deal? Shikamaru stammered awkwardly, finding that she had no voice with which to answer and very little clarity to begin with. Haku kept her mouth closed and her eyes clamped shut as she squeezed the closest thing to a friend she had managed to make in many years. Though it was blatantly obvious that Shikamaru was neither comfortable with nor fully accepting of the embrace, he made no move to end it. The unexpected tie-up was soon interrupted by a new arrival. Oh, so that's why you've been sneaking out. This is just precious. Haku didn't recognize the voice in any way at all, but through inference, she easily deduced who it belonged to. It was the voice of Shikamaru's male teammate, who had been stranded on the bank during Tsubasa's battle against Kakashi. It's not what you're thinking, Nar. I've already dealt with enough jokes tonight, Shikamaru said tiredly. The new boy, apparently named Nar, took an audible step forward. Sure, whatever you say. But you should probably be rapping. Whatever this is up soon. It's late as hell. You need the rest, he reasoned. As Haku had immediately dreaded upon hearing Naruto speak, Shikamaru gently pried her from his body and held her in place by her shoulders. I've got to go. He's right. I need the sleep, he said gently, clearly sensing that she was anything but happy about the development. Nodding weakly, Haku stepped to the side and kept her eyes downcast as Shikamaru jogged to catch up with Naruto, who had started leaving without him. Once the boys were well and truly gone, Haku melted down to her knees. Why? Why did you have to run your mouth? She whispered to the long-gone boy she had come to so enjoy. She had been fully in tune with the reality that their reckoning would come soon, but the fact that it would be taking place in mere hours had struck her like a spear. She wasn't ready, not remotely. She had been afforded no time to sort her emotions, numb herself, or anything like it. The emotional wound would be fresh and raw. I can't lie to Zabuza-sama. Hell see right through me. Hell no right away, she said aloud, not bothering to keep her thoughts silent any longer. Then, despite her best efforts and against her own wishes, tears began to leak from her eyes. It just isn't fair. Why am I not allowed to have even a single friend? Why does everybody and everything I touch go away? She whimpered tearfully to the silent earth around her. Years of frustration, pain, and sadness had finally worked their way to the surface. A bitter laugh then echoed from her lungs. And how pathetic am I? I had 3 conversations with him. Only 3. That's all it took to drive me in too deep. I'm just a desperate wretch. She berated herself. She then shook her head and buried her face in her hands. Fathers can be a little bit detached sometimes. I know mine can be. I don't know yours and probably never will. But I doubt he doesn't care if he took the trouble to adopt you, Haku. I'm a tool, Shikamaru. I always have been. I always will be. She hissed bitterly. While she held no genuine eye for Zabuza himself, as doing so would be immensely selfish given that he was entirely the reason she was alive in the first place, she utterly despised her own reality. You're a cool person, Haku shook her head once again, but this time more rapidly, almost as though she was trying to shake the words from her psyche entirely. I'm not even a person, Haku whispered hoarsely. Fresh out of tears, she peeled her hands from her damp face and looked to the moon one final time with a quivering bottom lip. I'll kill you gently, Shikamaru. Your mind tomorrow. Satsuki strained heavily against the weight on her shoulders as she hauled a stack of 5 planks across the shockingly broad bridge. Work had begun on the structure at 5:30 that morning, and it had not slowed for even a moment in the 3 hours since. The tasks were mundane and repetitive, but they were strenuous, lifting wooden planks, taking them across and laying them down over and over again. Get the other end of this thing, Nar. Satsuki grunted as she neared the opposite end of the bridge from whence she had come. Nar, who was working alongside Shikamaru to pry a crooked beam free to replace it more straightly, stood up from his crouched stance. He then circled around behind Satsuki and pushed up on the back end of the planks she was carrying, which were beginning to dip in level. The pair then walked the planks several meters to the left and set them down in front of Suna, who nodded approvingly. That should be it for now. I have what I need. The others can take it from here, he said, much to the relief of the genin. A few moments later, workers from other sections of the bridge arrived to relieve them of their tasks for the time being, Shikamaru included. Stay on guard. We still have work to do. The Nara said tiredly as he trudged over to his teammates who had taken a seat leaned against the railing of the bridge. Satsuki gestured to Suna, who was directing his workers diligently. We're still right next to him, and our eyes are open. Kakashi is watching from up above as well. He's safe, she said firmly. Shikamaru reluctantly nodded and kept his eyes drifting from one side of the bridge to the other. He was clearly on edge and with good reason. Satsuki herself was well and truly feeling the pressure of the situation, momentarily quiet as it currently was. Zabuza's arrival and subsequent rampage had taken place incredibly quickly last time and likely would the second time around. Why do you never call him sensei? Nar asked after a stretch of silence. Satsuki glanced at him and then up at Kakashi, who was standing watchfully atop a vertically balanced beam that stretched upward nearly 25 feet. Not sure. It just doesn't feel right, I guess, she said. Honestly, the blonde joined her in studying their teacher for a few moments. I think you owe him the courtesy. When push comes to shove, he's our only lifeline. We're dead meat without him, he said. The Uchiha girl returned her gaze to the concrete surface of the bridge on which they were sitting. Don't remind me. I'll come around to saying it eventually. Just not right now, she mumbled. In a moment of rare perceptiveness, Naruto switched the topic in a clear attempt to lift the mood. I found out why Shikamaru's been sneaking out a bunch last night, he said in a lower tone so as to prevent his male teammate from hearing him. Satsuki's interest peaked quickly as she had pondered a number of reasons as to why the Nara had been slipping away. Let me guess, he was napping, she asked. The blonde shook his head and smirked a bit in the direction of Shikamaru, whose back was turned to them. When I went to go check on him last night, he was with a girl. She looked around our age, maybe a little older. They were looking nice and friendly, he said. Riley. Satsuki raised an eyebrow and let a humorous grin begin to form on her face. How friendly are we talking? She pressed in a whisper. Nar waved a dismissive hand and kept his gaze fixed on Shikamaru to ensure that he wasn't eavesdropping. Nothing too intimate, but she was hugging him pretty tight. He looked so lost, he said. The Uchiha girl gave him a bored look and tucked a strand of hair behind her left ear, like you wouldn't be. I'm guessing you interrupted them and brought him back home. She inquired. Nar nodded and suppressed a chuckle. Yeah, I almost felt bad. She looked sort of heartbroken about him leaving. He definitely didn't seem to be in a good mood on the way back either, he said. Satsuki looked to the unaware Nar standing only 10 or so feet away from them. Didn't think he had the game for that sort of thing, but good for him. Making friends way out here probably wasn't a great idea, though. Even if we make it out in one piece, Oral leaving soon, she said, her tone nearly sounding sympathetic at points. Nar absently drummed his fingers on the bridge. Don't you think that's a little dumb, though? It almost feels like things are set up so we can't be close to anybody but our own people, he said more to himself than Satsuki. The Uchiha girl straightened out one of her legs in front of her and rested her right arm on her remaining bent knee. We were at war not too long ago. I don't know a ton about it, but things are apparently still tense internationally. Not so much that war is really a concern, but enough to make cross-country traveling a little bit risky these days, she replied. Nar exhaled through his nose. Politics are stupid. I hated that class, he said tiredly. Satsuki nodded in agreement and shifted to make herself more comfortable on the hard concrete surface. I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed it. It was just a bunch of propaganda and boring statistics. It's the only class one came close to failing, she said in a far less than fond tone. Nar snickered. Nice to know that even the class queen could be a bad student sometimes, he said humorously. Satsuki barked a short laugh and scrunched up her nose. I never asked to be put up on a pedestal. It's not my fault most of you are a bunch of sheep, she said dryly. Nar visibly prickled at her words, but quickly calmed himself and settled back down. Don't go hoping that Shikamaru or I are going to worship you or anything like that because we won't, he said. Though it was hardly a supportive statement, Satsuki found herself feeling quite satisfied with its message. To be the object of widespread affection had never exactly pleased the girl, and to be without the irritating calls and stares had been quite peaceful upon the formation of their cell. Good, just keep it in your head that I'm still ahead of you, she replied. The blonde eyed her out of the corner of his periphery and scowled. You just love hearing yourself talk, don't you? He asked irritatedly. Satsuki shrugged and relaxed a bit against the solid surface to her back. You say that like you don't run your mouth twice as much as I do, she countered lightly. Before Naruto could predictably fire back, any positivity and ease that had found its way into the atmosphere was swiftly put down by Shikamaru, who snapped them both to attention with his voice. On your feet. We've got mist. Kakashi leapt down from his perch and hit the ground just a few feet from his genin, who were staring apprehensively at the western end of the bridge. A mist was rolling in and quickly at that narrowing his visible eye, Kakashi made his way in front of the group and cracked his neck. Surround Suna and get an information. We've been over this already, he ordered them. The teens obliged and positioned themselves in a tight triangular shape around the bridge builder. The silver-haired ninja then glanced over at the dozen or so workers who were standing around tensely. They clearly weren't entirely aware of what was about to occur, but they were smart enough to know that it was anything but good. Unless you want to be vivisected, run away, Kakashi called out to them. Needing no more prompting, the workers scampered away toward the eastern end of the bridge to escape to the ground on the other side of it. Thankfully, and surprisingly, each of them was able to set foot on natural ground without injury or incident. With them gone, all that remained on the bridge was Team 7. He's taking a while this time, Naruto said nervously as the mist overlapped them and overtook the bridge in its entirety. Kakashi kept his silence and drew a kunai from the pouch strapped to his leg. He then tossed the small projectile out into the mist. A split second later, a flash of sparks accompanied by a metallic sound of collision alerted the cell's collective senses. Giving up on ambushes this time around. Are we? Kakashi said in a tone just loud enough to reach across the space before them. The same mirthless chuckle that had haunted the cell once before then rang out in response. Why would I waste my time on something that wouldn't work? Even your BRZ saw it coming last time. Came the voice of Zabuza, who was not yet visible. Slowly but surely, the sound of footsteps became visible. As they drew closer, Kakashi noticed something unsettling. There were two sets of feet drumming off of the concrete. A few moments later, Zabuza came into view. Alongside him stood the very same hunter that had killed him a week prior. You were spot on, Shikamaru. Good work, Kakashi said, drawing a tense nod from the N. The Jonin then fixed his glare on Zabuza and the hunter. I see you brought some help. I never really took you for a team player, but looks can be deceiving, he said. The rogue swordsman pointed his sizable blade at Kakashi's chest. I'm not. Don't you worry. I just don't feel like wasting my chakra on clones for your underlings again, he explained. The hunter at his side promptly took a step forward in the direction of Satsuki, Naruto, and Shikamaru. At this motion, Kakashi drew a pair of kana. In that case, keep your eyes on me, he said as he prepared to engage Zabuza for the second time. Zabuza visibly smirked below the bandages that covered his neck and mouth. I wouldn't be too confident in your BRZ against her. She's about as strong as I am, if not more so, he said darkly. Before Kakashi could react, the hunter, who Zabuza's pronoun had confirmed to be female, charged forward at a blistering speed. In an instant, Satsuki blitzed to meet her in the middle. The two came together with a shower of sparks as the Uchiha girl's swiftly drawn kana struggled against a sunbi utilized by the huntress and Satsuki as the strongest gen in Konoha has to offer. Kakashi countered as his student strained against her masked foe. Zabuza responded by gesturing for the Jonin to come forward. Though he was quite bothered by the notion of leaving his team by their lonesome once again, he had another war to win and he knew it. A beat later, both Zabuza and Kakashi vanished into puffs of smoke. Satsuki gritted her teeth as she and the huntress repelled off one another. Taking a glance around and straining her ears, she caught the sound of clashing blades not too far from their location. Zabuza and Kakashi had begun their duel elsewhere. Taking a deep breath, the raven-haired girl focused her attention back on the masked girl before her. You're a woman, huh? I guess it makes sense. I thought I smelled perfume on you when we came together just now, Satsuki said. The huntress remained silent and stepped forward. The slight shift in weight prompted Satsuki to engage once more. Taking the lead aggressively, the Uchiha girl swung her kani at the hunter's head, a strike that was easily ducked underneath. As Satsuki stumbled forward from her own momentum, her masked foe drove her left knee up into her stomach. The blow drew a clinch from the genin, but she managed to regroup just enough to avoid having her neck skewered by the following swipe of the huntress. With the exchange decisively belonging to Tsubasa's ally, Satsuki backed up several steps and joined the huntress in circling around the perimeter of their makeshift arena of sorts. She was at a large speed disadvantage, and it had shown through in their first clash. As she pondered what to do next, the huntress took initiative with a rush forward. Satsuki planted her feet and braced herself. In the split second before the huntress collided with her, the Uchiha girl spotted that her opponent had drawn a second sunban. When the impact came, Satsuki was only able to catch one of the huntress' wrists. As such, she fully expected to be skewered on the exposed side of her neck. Surprisingly, the expected sting never came. Instead, the masked woman extended her free arm over Satsuki's shoulder and flicked her wrist forward. The sunban quickly launched from her hand. She was going for them all along. The Uchiha girl lamented as she pointlessly craned her neck to watch helplessly as the needle sailed toward her teammates. A half-beat later, Shikamaru jerked his head and neck backward. The sunban then whizzed past the front of his throat, only missing by mere centimeters. "This is between you and me. Leave them out of it," Satsuki hissed. She then shoved the huntress back and sent her back a few meters with a kick to the center of her chest. The masked woman dusted off the front of her garb and made a sign with her left hand. "Facing me alone hurts you more than it does me. I've killed greater men and women than you," the huntress said, finally choosing to speak. The voice was muffled and clearly somewhat altered by the presence of the mask upon her face, but the voice was clearly feminine. Satsuki assumed her stance in response. "If you're having any trouble with me, then you don't want anything to do with taking us all at once," she said as confidently as she could. The huntress shook her head and tapped her foot on the ground. Then, in an instant, all of the moisture that had accumulated on the concrete from the mist froze over into solid ice. Satsuki's eyes widened. She only used one hand for seals. Is that even possible? She wondered in a slight panic. Giving her no time to process, the huntress charged forward and snapped the Uchiha girl's head back with a sharp punch that sent her stumbling to the ground due to the lack of traction on the ground. "Talk less and pay better attention," the masked woman said as she bared down over Satsuki with a sun made of ice hovering over her head. She then stabbed the needle down toward the genin's chest. Just as the sharpened point was about to puncture Satsuki's body, the huntress retracted the motion and stood up straight again. She then sharply pivoted off to her left, allowing Naro, who had taken action to defend his teammate, to sail past her before the blonde could fully pass her. However, the huntress seized him by the front of his shirt and tossed him up into the air. "What were you thinking?" Satsuki practically screamed as the huntress conjured icy senin between each of her fingers. Said needles were then thrown directly up at the airborne blonde. After a few moments of tense silence, Naruto crashed to the ground only 5 or so feet from Satsuki. He had been skewered by 6 of the 8 needles that had been sent up at him, and he appeared to be in considerable pain, but none of the wounds were critical in nature. "You all right?" the blonde asked in a strained tone as he painfully rolled onto his knees. Satsuki did the same and rubbed her cheek where the huntress had struck her moments beforehand. "The deal was that you only step in if I lost or died. Neither of those things happened," she complained through a clenched jaw. Nar picked 2 of the freezing needles from his chest and shook his head. "You looked pretty much screwed to me. At least try to be grateful for once," he said. Though she very much would have argued on any other occasion, the girl held her tongue and stood to her feet alongside her teammate. The huntress had interestingly stood inert during the short exchange of words and was in the same position as she had been upon sending Naruto flying. "Why do I feel like the 2 of you are going to be a pain?" she muttered just loud enough for her voice to be heard by the genin. She then took a glance at Shikamaru, who was standing in a defensive position in front of Suna, ready to move at a moment's notice. "I normally wouldn't do this for a group as green as you all, but I'd rather make this quick," she said vaguely, her attention firmly back on Naruto and Satsuki. She then made a series of hand seals. "We're about to get stabbed again, aren't we?" Nar asked nervously. Satsuki held her ground and pursed her lips in a thin line as the huntress completed her sequence of signs. "She was already whipping us both without much trouble. Whatever she's about to do, it's probably bad news for us," she thought to herself grimly. The huntress' arms then split out to either side. For a moment, there was silence. Then the air around the genin dropped in temperature and was drained of its moisture. Slabs of ice then began to form around them, each of which were about as tall as the huntress and a few feet wide. What in the Nar began, trailing off breathlessly as the sheets of ice polished into reflective surfaces and began to levitate. Stranger yet, the huntress began to walk backwards toward one of the freezing sheets. When her back touched the ice, she quite literally melted into it. As you likely gathered earlier, I have a special ability of sorts. I can use my chakra to create ice and bend it to my will. It's my Keek-Jenk, the huntress said as the slab she now appeared to be trapped within rose to join its fellow icy slabs in perpetual levitation. Soon enough, the ice stopped shifting around. Each icy sheet was reflective to the point of projecting a mirror image, and they had formed into a dome that completely encapsulated the two genin. This jutsu is my most potent. Probably overkill given your inexperience, but this way you're guaranteed to be dead within a few minutes. This is the demonic ice mirrors, the huntress said, her voice seeming to echo from all sides. You missed one of us, bright eyes. Satsuki called out to the masked woman, whose image was now reflected into every single one of the icy mirrors. Indeed, Shikamaru still remained outside of the unusual formation alongside Suna. The huntress gave no visible acknowledgement. He can be dealt with later. As of now, the two of you are my priority. I'd focus if I were you, because things are about to become far more difficult for you, she said in a blank voice. Nar began to reply, but was cut off when a storm of needles rained down upon them from every direction. Both the uchiha and blonde moved to defend themselves, but were both struck by a multitude of needles anyway. Nobody has ever survived the situation you're in right now. Fighting back is pointless, the huntress said calmly from her mirrors. Satsuki wiped a bit of blood from her now cut cheek and steeled herself. There's a first time for everything. Kakashi spat blood out of his mouth as he avoided decapitation by the thinnest of margins. Once the blade of Zabuza had flown over his head, the Jonin kicked low at the Rogu's ankle and swept him off his feet momentarily. A wild scramble for position quickly ensued, resulting in Zabuza receiving a cut below his right eye and Kakashi being struck across the right side of his jaw. Both ninja retreated several steps upon the engagement's conclusion. You're not as sharp as you were. Did I really rattle you that badly last time? Zabuza goaded Kakashi, who shrugged slightly and kept his senses sharp. Well, I've mostly been stuck in bed the past week. And I mean that just about literally, he said, drawing a low laugh from the rogue swordsman. I suppose I can't be too proud of my own performance. Then I'll kill you either way, but I'd have preferred a less rusty version of you, he said. Kakashi triggered off of his words and charged in. The pair traded strikes twice, with each missing on their first attempt to strike the other across the neck with their respective blades. The second layer of the exchange decisively went to Kakashi. Having picked up on a patternable rhythm to Zabuza's offense, he delayed his entry into the rogue space a split second. The deliberate pause resulted in Zabuza swinging and missing for a second consecutive time with his sword. The overextension left the left side of his face exposed, and as such, Kakashi wheeled up his right leg and slammed his shinbone into Zabuza's temple. The blow briefly staggered the larger man, causing him to lurch forward and stumble. With his posture bent over, Kakashi ruthlessly capitalized by driving the point of his left knee up into the rogue's forehead. The combination of impacts sent Zabuza reeling back. Or maybe I've still got it, Kakashi said casually as his foe regained his wits and reassumed his stance. Zabuza rubbed the side of his head and blinked several times. He then looked off to his right. He then chuckled and shook his head. You'd better hope your genin do too. That and more because they're in neck deep, he said ominously. The Jonin scowled and looked to where Zabuza had just seconds prior. What he saw was greatly concerning. Naruto and Satsuki, both of whom appeared ragged, were trapped within a complex structure of ice. Shikamaru was stranded outside of it and looked more than slightly frustrated. The only positive to be taken from the sight was that Suna was unharmed and that nobody was dead. What is that? Kakashi muttered under his breath. With sharp ears, Zabuza picked up on his nearly silent question. Letting his blade drop to his side for a moment, the rogue admired the work of his subordinate. Not even I can escape that jutsu once it's in place. The girl's a prodigy. That's the long and short of it, he said. A cruel smirk then slithered across his bandaged face. Your kids are as good as dead. Haku has never left a target alive, he said confidently. Kakashi noted what he assumed to be the name of the huntress and uncovered his left eye. I'll just have to speed things up. In that case, Satsuki heaved a deep breath and ducked down sharply to avoid a trio of needles. The past 4 minutes had been hell on earth, and she was feeling the effects. Ducking and dodging, blocking and enduring. It was a never-ending cycle of defensive desperation, and her energy was being sapped little by little with each frantic movement. Nar was faring a bit better in terms of stamina, but he had been struck by the needles nearly twice as much as the Uchiha girl. He simply wasn't fast enough to evade them. We need to make ourselves a narrower target. She's just picking us off every time we move. If she focuses all of her firepower on one of us, somebody is going to die soon. Satsuki thought to herself, yanking Nar down to the ground to save him from being punctured through the cheek as the thought crossed her mind. Back to back, Nar. We need to try something different. Satsuki hissed, sensing that there was little point in not at least trying it. The blonde nodded and pressed his back to hers as they stood up to a vertical position. The duo then drew a pair of kunai. Each embraced themselves for the next onset. Your thinking is too straightforward, came the voice of the huntress. A moment later, with no warning, Nar was doubled over by an unseen strike that sent him to his knees. Satsuki's back was then lit up with nearly a dozen needles through the opening that Naruto's drop had created. Crying out in pain, the Uchiha girl fell forward. She barely caught herself on her hands in time to prevent her head from colliding with the concrete. She punched me in the gut. That wasn't a needle, as she's ridiculously fast. Nar groaned. Satsuki coughed heavily into her palm. When she removed it from her mouth, there was blood. Not much, but enough to be slightly concerning. I think I got all the needles this time, Satsuki said rigidly. Nar then turned to face her, gasping slightly at the sight of her punctured back. Without hesitation, he began rapidly picking the needles from her skin. Satsuki yelled at the stabbing pain each removal caused, but remained still until the end. Thanks for that, she muttered once her teammate had finished tending to her. They then returned to their feet, as ready as they could be to continue their unwinnable battle with the huntress. Before either one of them could even begin to form some sort of plan of attack, Naruto was buckled again, this time by what appeared to be a strike to his jaw. Drawing on what had happened less than a minute prior, Satsuki made a long dive to her left. Your guesswork is improving, the masked woman said from the mirrors as a swarm of needles stabbed into the concrete where the raven-haired girl had been standing only a moment ago. Satsuki's victory was incredibly short-lived, however, as while she had evaded being struck by the sunbon for a second time, her retreat had left Naruto by his lonesome. With a swiftness and raw speed that Satsuki's eyes could hardly follow. The huntress brutally kicked her teammate in the ribs and sent him tumbling toward her. Satsuki was able to catch him before he could slam into one of the ice mirrors, preventing him from taking any more punishment for the time being. After being steadied to a kneeling position, Naruto forced a smile. We're really getting up here, aren't we? He asked rhetorically in an attempt to humor. Satsuki looked on with worry as he attempted to stand. He made it to his feet, but only after a significant struggle. She's targeting him because he's slower than me. I can see and dodge the worst of her charges almost every time when I have room to think, but he's relying almost entirely on reflex. He won't last much longer like this, she thought to herself. As she began to stand up, she saw the huntress form in a mirror directly over Naruto's head. Each of her hands were loaded with sanbon, and she was preparing to throw them. Not right now, please. Not right now, she begged the powers that be. Then something strange happened. Unlike every other occasion on which the needles had been sent their way, Satsuki saw them leave the huntress' hands. They were still moving quickly, but they were fully visible to the Uchiha girl. Uncertain and exhausted as she was, Satsuki took advantage of the odd new situation by drawing a kunai and tossing it at an arc to intercept the needles. Surprisingly, the tactic worked. Satsuki's kunai took the brunt of the impact with only 2 of the original 8 managing to complete their journey toward Nar. The rest were deflected. As an added bonus, the 2 remaining needles missed Nar to both his right and left. How did I? Satsuki began greatly surprised by her own abilities. Nar then turned to look at her, and when he did, his eyes widened to saucers. Satsuki, your eyes, he said in an abrupt tone. The raven-haired girl immediately shifted her gaze to one of the ice mirrors, and what she saw was both incredibly heartening and very surprising. Her irises had turned red, and her pupils were rimmed by a pair of tomo on her right eye and a single tamo on her left. Her sharing had finally awoken. We might have something to work with now, she said with a small amount of renewed enthusiasm. Nar nodded and took a deep breath. I'm not sure how those eyes work, but I'll take anything we can get at this point, he said. Satsuki fixed her newly acquired dojutsu on the huntress, who was looking on through her blankly still mask. I hate to ask, but could you cover me? I've got something I want to try, she requested. Nar gave her a thumbs up and widened his stance. Satsuki then began to weave hand seals as quickly as she could. Though he was unable to see the huntress move, as had been proven numerous times, the blonde was able to infer where she would be headed based on past encounters. As such, Nar took a calculated gamble by throwing himself out of position to cover Satsuki's left side. The maneuver worked for better or worse. Having guessed correctly, Nar absorbed a harsh punch to his forehead that had clearly been meant for his teammate. Due to having braced for the blow, Naruto was able to prevent himself from falling over from the impact. The huntress then retreated back toward the same mirror from whence she had come. Checkmate, Satsuki projected to the masked women within her mind. With her heightened perception and reaction speed, the uchiha girl reared her head back and aimed her jutsu at the mirror the huntress was barreling toward. Fire style. Fireball jutsu. She yelled. The burst of fire then launched itself forward from Satsuki's mouth. The burning stream collided with the mirror just before the huntress could reach it, causing her to stop in her tracks midair. Now Nar. Satsuki yelled. Needing no more signaling, Nar mustered his strength and leapt straight upward to meet the huntress. The blonde swung wide for their masked foe's head with his right hand. Unfortunately, he was easily evaded and violently countered, forming two bonds, seemingly out of nothing. The huntress impaled both of Naruto's shoulders with needles and used him as a launchpad to kick off. The extra momentum allowed the huntress to melt into one of her mirrors once again, and the impact of her feet on the blonde's stomach sent Naruto spiraling to the ground. Much to Satsuki's surprise and relief, her teammate was able to land on his feet after performing a slight roll on his way down. That almost worked. We need to try it again, Naruto said after ripping the sunbi out of his shoulders and tossing them aside. He was battered and his physical condition was worsening by the minute, but he was utterly refusing to slow down. Can you handle another exchange like that? She would have killed you if she'd aimed a little higher. Satsuki asked pointedly as she scanned each of the mirrors with her sharing to search for openings or the start of another attack from the huntress. The blonde straightened his posture and produced a kunai from his pouch. That doesn't matter. We've got a job to do. If she kills us, Shikamaru won't have much of anything for her, he said strongly. Satsuki gazed at him as his knees involuntarily buckled under his own body weight. Naro, she thought to herself with great worry. He had absolutely no concern for his own well-being. Another clash with the huntress would almost certainly put him completely out of commission. He was nearing the end of his rope. Shaking her head to clear away her sentimentality, Satsuki began gathering her chakra. Try to actually injure her. We need to make this count, she said, eliciting a curt nod from her teammate. Once again, Satsuki began to perform the sequence for her fireball jutsu. Unlike before, however, the huntress came charging from her mirrors far earlier. Somehow, Naruto was able to once again predict her location and position himself accordingly. In stark contrast to the previous sequence of events, Naruto did not simply act as a shield. As he leapt across space to prevent the huntress from interrupting Satsuki's jutsu, Naruto cracked the masked woman on the temple with a harsh right-handed punch fueled by his body weight and forward movement. The punch knocked the huntress off course and forced her to touch down on the ground for the first time since she had initiated her demonic ice mirrors. Fire-style fireball jutsu. Satsuki yelled for the second time. Once again, she sent a burst of searing fire directly at the huntress who jumped up to avoid being burned. Satsuki chased her across the airspace by changing her aim and forcing out a second blast of fire. The huntress was forced to twist and roll midair to just barely avoid being caught directly in the literal line of fire. Damn it, so close. Satsuki mentally hissed as her fire fizzled out. She had singed the slightest edges of her foe's robes, but no actual damage had been done. Within seconds, the huntress was back in her mirrors, safe from harm. Satsuki pushed down her frustration and looked to Naruto, who was back on his feet. I managed to nail her pretty hard on the way in. I didn't hurt her much, but at least we know we can touch her if we play this the right way, he said optimistically. The raven-haired girl SL licked her dark hair back, which was now damp with sweat from exertion. Yeah, that's good. I probably don't have more than 2 shots left in me, though. If at all possible, try to push her into my jutsu, she said through her fatigue. An unwelcome voice then pierced into the two Gen's eardrums. I must say, you've been more troublesome than you have any right to be. Dealing with both of you at once has been irritating to say the least. I think I'll be changing that dynamic now, the huntress said darkly. Then there was silence. Slowly but surely, each of the reflections of the huntress filled their hands with sun. Satsuki's eyes widened in fear. The needles were then sent tearing from the mirrors at a predictably blazing speed. With the help of her sharing, the Uchiha girl deduced where they were headed well ahead of time. She's aiming for Nar. None of those are headed for me. She's trying to kill him right here and now, she thought to herself. Terror quickly set in as the rain of Sunbon rapidly approached Nar, whose senses were too dull by exhaustion and the damage he had already taken to alert him to the mortal danger he was in. He doesn't see them. He can't feel them coming. He won't be able to react in time. Satsuki thought to herself. She was only 10 feet away from him, which wasn't especially far normally speaking. But in the present situation, 10 feet was 10 miles, and Kana would be useless. There were simply too many needles. He'll die. He's hiding it. But he's already badly hurt. There's no way he can take all of that. It'll kill him. Satsuki mentally panicked. A deadly solution then crossed her mind. Should I? Is it worth it? She pondered as the needles grew ever closer. Time seemed to move in slow motion as the cruel reality of death crashed toward both genin in different forms. I'll protect them this time, no matter what it costs me. At the memory of what she had sworn less than a day ago, Satsuki's stomach and chest were flooded with a burning feeling of fear that froze her in her tracks. It was entirely up to her. The life of another human being laid firmly in her hands. All she had to do was act or hold back. The needles then seemed to increase in velocity. They were closer now, closer to swiftly ending Naruto's tenure on Earth. At this sight, Satsuki's fear burst into a wildfire of frenzied emotion. Protect it. Protect what you care about. Suck it up and quit shaking. She coached herself, forcing herself into motion as the berating thoughts sliced into her. She needed desperately to move faster. She wouldn't reach him in time at her current pace. Move. Don't be a spectator. Protect what's yours, Satsuki. Uchiha. The raven-haired girl's inner voice screamed at her. With one final desperate push, Satsuki threw herself forward. He had known that he was bound to die. The words of the huntress had made it all too clear that she was sick and tired of dealing with a functioning pair. From there, all it took was simple deductive reasoning. Satsuki's sharing granted her more than enough perception and reactive speed to keep herself safe. Nar lacked such senses. He was tougher than she was by a wide margin. The sheer volume of punishment he had endured would have killed Satsuki in half the time. Unfortunately, that durability mattered little in the grand scheme of things. Though he could not see or perceive the assault coming his way, Naruto knew it was coming. The end had arrived, and there was nothing he could do about it. Fully expecting a harsh impact or the feeling of 1,000 tiny puncture wounds, the blonde braced himself as best he could. No such sensations came to him. In fact, he felt no pain at all when the split second of time he had been afforded passed. Instead, he found that he was being tightly squeezed by something. Opening his eyes fully, Nar identified what was holding onto him so firmly. Satsuki the blonde began unevenly. Indeed, what he found when he fully processed his immediate surroundings was his teammate. Satsuki was tightly hugging him with her arms snuggly wrapped around the back of his neck and her face resting into his shoulder. The rest of her body was flattened against his entirely. It took Nar virtually no time at all to deduce what it all meant. Her entire body was littered with sunburn from the back of her neck all the way down to her ankles. Naruto's blood froze in his veins. What the hell is wrong with you? Why would you? He started, not bothering to finish his sentence when Satsuki's grip on him slipped and she began to melt to the ground. Immediately moving to support her, Naruto knelt down with the raven-haired girl resting in his lap. She was barely conscious. The shock of the sheer number of times she had been wounded at once had taken its toll. Despite it, her somehow still present Sharingan shifted to his face as he cradled the back of her head. I'm as lost as you. It all just happened. It was too quick, she said weakly. Nar shook his head and began frantically picking needles from her sides and the sides of her neck. That's crap. You've got a reason. You would never just do something like this. He insisted, panic and confusion tearing apart his ability to speak clearly. Satsuki flinched and shifted in his arms as more span were removed from her body. Maybe that's why you said something like that a few days ago, she said quietly. Her voice was weakening with every word. The blonde quit tending to her wounds and met her eyes with a look of puzzlement on his face. What do you mean? He asked. The Uchiha girl shakily reached up and gently pressed her fingers to his neck, right where his pulse rhythmically beat in and out. Her hand remained on his neck during her following response. Why you said that? You knew that I wouldn't be there for you when push came to shove. That I'd let you die, she said. Naruto's expression twisted into one of guilt-ridden grief at her words. I just wanted to make you leave me alone. I didn't mean that. He said with his eyes clamped shut. Satsuki's hand then softly drifted away from his neck and back down to her side. It's not like I didn't deserve to hear it, Nar. Not after what I said to you, she said honestly, her Sharingan finally fading away and reverting her eyes to their normal black color. The blonde clenched his jaw and moved to begin picking needles out of her. When he reached for one that had somehow lodged into her stomach, Satsuki gently took hold of his hand with her own and gave a nearly imperceptible shake of her head. It's okay. There's nothing why you can do. I'm dying, Nar. I'm dying, she said softly, repeating the declaration of her own nearing end several times. The blonde shook his head rapidly and opened his eyes again. I don't want you to die. I'm not going to let you die. He assured her with all the firmness of a wet piece of paper. It was then that his eyes finally overflowed. Any pride he had felt in being a shinobi had burned to ash. On his very first task outside of his own home, a teammate and the closest thing he had ever had to a friend of some sort was cascading toward a sudden demise. It was painful, tremendously so. I'm not going to let this happen. He practically whispered more to himself than his teammate. For all that they had fought, disagreed with, and hounded one another, Naruto had come to value the volatile girl in his arms. Hearing his hoarse self-talk and the tears dripping down his face, Satsuki's bloodstained lips pulled into a small smile. You're really crying for me. You're such a sap, she said. She then released his hand from her grip and reached up. She then wiped a few tears from his cheeks. Thank you, though. If the last thing I'm ever going to see is why you crying over me, then I'm okay with that. It could be so much worse than this, she said gratefully. The light in her eyes then dulled. Sensing this, Naruto shook her a bit. Save your energy. Stop talking, Satsuki. He begged her emotionally. The raven-haired girl took a deep breath and met his wide, concerned eyes one last time. Give her hell for me, Nar, she said in a decaying, breathless tone. Then finally, her body entirely went limp. The blonde shook her once again a moment later. Hey, quit messing around. We're in the middle of a fight. Don't sleep, he muttered, unable to force himself to raise his voice. No response and another shake of her frame. Answer me when I'm talking to you. Don't ignore me. Nar begged a touch louder. With each subsequent rocking, there came no response from the inert girl who lay dead in his arms. Eventually, with no more denial left in him, Naruto hugged Satsuki's head into his chest and clamped his eyes shut as burning tears soaked his face again. Satsuki, he whimpered tearfully. She was well and truly gone. In an instant, a strong-willed, prodigious, intelligent girl had been reduced to a bloodied corpse. As Nar bitterly pondered the cruelty of the situation, another voice chimed in. She really threw herself into the fire for you. An odd choice given that you're about to die. The confident words of belittlement had come from the huntress. In an instant, Naruto's temper flared. Using the last of his self-restraint, he gently laid Satsuki on her back and closed her eyes with his fingertips. Once the task was done, he rose to his feet with his eyes still downcast. All of the sadness and sorrow he felt from the passing of Satsuki was rapidly replaced by burning fury. As his anger consumed him, the air within the dome of ice began to heat up. I'm going to make you pay for what you did to her. The blonde growled. His palms then began to bleed from his clenched fists. His nails were lengthening rapidly, as were his canines. In a rapid explosion, red chakra flew forth from the gen's body and spiraled up into the air. A roar of repressed anguish and indignation then ripped from Naruto's lungs and shook the entire bridge. The spiraling tower of burning chakra then condensed around him and streamlined into a flaming aura. His eyes were blood red. His canines had sharpened into serrated fangs, and his nails had lengthened into claws. With a glance back over his shoulder, he saw that Satsuki's body was still unharmed. He then bared his teeth and roared once again. His mind was a haze of rage and murderous intent. The shock waves sent forth from his body by his exclamation cracked every single of the ice mirrors badly. He then focused his eyes on where he knew the true location of the huntress to be. In one powerful motion, Nar burst forward and slammed his fist into the reflection of his masked foe. Instantly, the mirror shattered, and out of it came exactly who he had been aiming for. The huntress flew backwards and tumbled to the ground. The moment she made contact with the concrete, all of the ice mirrors shattered into a shimmering dust of snow. Not slowing his momentum even slightly, Naruto charged after her aggressively. Something precious had been stolen from him, and he would take it back in blood. The huntress had landed just a few feet away from Shikamaru, who looked momentarily shell-shocked. Nar then increased his velocity to prevent any sort of conflict between the two. When he reached them, he opened his hand and swiped at the masked woman's throat with his newly acquired claws. The huntress ducked underneath the attempt at decapitation. Though he was able to catch himself with his feet under him, Naruto was in no position to avoid the harsh punch that he ran face first into. The strike snapped his head back and backed him up a step, but did little to genuinely damage him. The defining lesson that his deranged, violent mind was able to take from the sequence was that despite the incredible increase in power he had experienced, he still needed to be wary of the huntress' speed. With his eyes locked on her, Nar stepped forward to attack the masked woman once again. Though she appeared to begin to do the same, she abruptly froze in place. Now Nar, as hard as you can, Shikamaru yelled. It was then that the blonde realized that the Nar had connected his shadow to the huntress in the midst of the confusion. Taking the slim opening with both hands, Naruto blitzed forward and cracked the huntress square between the eyes of her mask with all the force he could muster. The subordinate of Zabuza was sent crashing to the ground nearly 10 feet away. For a time, there was no movement. Eventually, though, the huntress sat up and began to rise to her feet once again. Due to the impact of Naruto's fist, her mask had been completely shattered, leaving her face bare and exposed. Shikamaru felt his stomach drop as the face of the huntress became visible for the first time. Brown eyes, fair, light skin, and pink lips. It was exactly as he had initially expected. He had been entirely right. Had he only remained confident in his instincts, the shock he was experiencing at present would have been non-existent. Haku, he breathed. The same girl he had laughed and bantered with. The same girl he had been forced to pick lies with. She had murdered Satsuki. And now she was standing face-to-face with Nar, who had undergone a violent, monstrous transformation upon the death of the Uchiha. Seeming to have heard him, if only slightly, Haku turned her head toward him and held eye contact with him for a few seconds. Though her features were blank and emotionless, her eyes held a sea of conflict. "We'll talk later," she said simply. She then turned her attention back to Naruto, whose expression was viscerally enraged. He appeared to recognize Haku as well, if only from his brief glimpse of her the previous night. With his left eye twitching and his fists clenched, the blonde finally spoke. "Is this some kind of sick joke? The girl Shikamaru was sneaking out for?" he demanded through clenched teeth. Haku visibly flinched at his tone. She clearly didn't like being a known quantity, and the fact that she was seemed to be fueling Naruto's already intense wrath. "What I've done lately affects nothing," she shot back. Nar tilted his head to one side with a disturbing look in his eyes. Shikamaru then felt a prick of cold moisture on the top of his head. In addition to the mist, it had begun to rain. Ignoring the new shift in weather, Naruto took a heavy step forward. "What would have happened if I hadn't walked in on you two last night? Would you have slaughtered him, too?" he questioned darkly. Haku lowered her stance and prepared to fight. "He'd have been dead long before you arrived if I'd wanted to kill him that night," she replied. The grief-stricken genin returned his head to a vertical position and dug his feet into the rough concrete. "You would have taken everything from me, and you're still going to try," he said hollowly. Haku's words had entirely fallen on deaf ears. Nar was completely and totally consumed by his negativity. No more words were spoken between them. A beat later, they charged to meet one another halfway. The clash was telling, though they initially halted each other in their tracks with nearly equal impacts. Naruto quickly wrenched Haku off balance and plastered her across the left side of her jaw with an elbow. Haku quickly rebounded from the staggering blow and returned fire by lacing the oncoming genin with a straight punch that landed squarely behind his left ear. The strike knocked Naruto off balance momentarily, but he was utterly unfazed. With great ferocity, he continued his charge and doubled the huntress over with a harsh driving knee to her solar plexus. With no hesitation, Nar seized her by her hair and yanked her up to her feet again. "She's got nothing for him. Not as he is now." Shikamaru thought to himself solemnly, shivered slightly as his teammate brutally spun Haku's head to the side with a fully committed punch upon releasing his grip on her hair. Just as the thought crossed his mind, however, Haku made a hand seal with her left hand and produced a larger than usual sunbeam. She then slashed it across Naruto's face and sent a spray of blood across the concrete. Against every moral bone in his body, Shikamaru felt himself relax slightly at the sight of Haku's moment of success. "What the hell is wrong with me? She killed Satsuki. For God's sake, she lied to me over and over again. Why am I not happy watching her get thrashed?" he pondered as Naruto pushed through the blood streaming down his face and kicked Haku's legs out from under her. The Nara involuntarily flinched a moment later when his teammate slammed the point of his knee into the bottom of Haku's chin as she staggered to her feet. Shikamaru fought the urge to avert his eyes as Naruto continued to cleanly strike Haku at all levels. Body, head, and legs. Each of them were being comprehensively torn apart. Her head was routinely snapped back by punches. Her ribs were consistently tenderized by the blonde's knees and shin bone, and her legs had been swept out from under her multiple times. "Quit feeling sorry for her. She has this coming. She murdered a girl in cold blood." Shikamaru scolded himself as he forced himself to keep watching. It grew no easier to watch. Naruto was out for carnage, and he was getting what he wanted. Taking a deeper look into the blonde's eyes, Shikamaru found emotions other than anger. Pain, confusion, grief, and raw, undeniable sadness. He's barely holding it together. He'd be bawling his eyes out if he didn't have Satsuki's murderer right in front of him right now, he thought to himself grimly. Another set of sharp punches from Naruto then sent Haku staggering back. Unfortunately, she fell to her rear end right in front of the Nar. Shikamaru stumbled back a step and curled his hands into fists. Slowly and painfully, Haku dragged herself back up. "Please don't. I know you're about to." But Shikamaru mentally begged the girl. As he had feared, the huntress cast him a glance over her shoulder. She began to mouth something, but was cut off almost instantly by Nar suddenly appearing in front of her and knocking her flat on her back again. Eyes on me. Nar growled as he reached down and seized her by the front of her hunter's robe. He then picked her from the ground and held her up in front of him with their faces hovering close together. Shikamaru shuddered at the murderous tension in the air. Then, despite his better judgment, Shikamaru spoke. She's done, Nar. She can barely defend herself. He said carefully without moving his head or shifting his feet. Nar dragged his eyes away from Haku and fixed them on his teammate ominously. She's not done till I say she is. Looks to me like she's still breathing, he said darkly. Shikamaru held his ground and shook his head. Killing her is pointless. We can draw information out of her, he argued. Naruto eyed him dangerously and maintained his suspension of Haku's semi-limp form. You're working a little too hard for this. She just killed Satsuki, our teammate, our friend. You should want her dead as much as I do right now, he said huskily. Before Shikamaru could respond, Haku flared to life once more. Having silently formed an icy needle in her left hand, she stabbed the sunbond down toward Naruto's neck. With no difficulty whatsoever, the blonde caught her wrist. Cute, but worthless, he said coldly. He then clamped down on the wrist he had caught, producing an unsettling cracking sound that caused Haku to cry out in pain. He then turned his back to Shikamaru and dropped the huntress down to the concrete while maintaining his grip on the front of her robe. He then began dragging her toward the edge of the bridge. Kakashi shook his head and pursed his lips as he watched the events unfold before him. The sudden explosive increase in power Naruto had experienced several minutes prior had resulted in something of a temporary ceasefire between himself and Zabuza. As they both looked on in shock, unlike the rogue swordsman, Kakashi knew precisely what source Naruto was drawing his newfound strength from. The seal loosened. Apparently, raw emotion can force it to leak chakra if the trauma is extreme enough. I figured this would happen at some point, but Nar is putting out more raw power than even I can, he thought to himself. It was a baffling sight. 1 minute, Naruto had been on the verge of being broken down completely, and the next, he was savagely beating Haku into the ground. All because Satsuki had died in the crossfire. It was a truly horrible situation. I really never thought I'd see the day, came the voice of Zabuza, drawing the John's attention back to the man in front of him. Still on guard, Kakashi indulged him in his vagueness. The day your sidekick lost or the day you died? Because today is both. He asked. The rogue swordsman chuckled and shook his head. We're not done yet, so hold that second thought. The first one is accurate, though. Haku has hardly even struggled before. This is new territory. It really looks to me like she's going to die, he said in a nearly mystified tone. Kakashi raised an eyebrow at his tone. Don't you care? She seems quite loyal to you. If she weren't, she'd have run by now. Nar might be the most dangerous thing on this bridge right now. As included, he pressed. Zabuza shook his head and tightened his grip on his sword. She's a tool. Nothing more. A damn good one, but still a tool. I can find another one, he said blankly. The silver-haired ninja redrew his kunai and focused his eyes on Zabuza once again as he sensed the rising tension between them once more. You don't sound too sure of that. People are precious. Even if we try to tell ourselves we're just using them. I've been there. Trust me, he said. Zabuza took a step forward and reared his enormous blade back in preparation to strike. Giving advice to the enemy. You're soft, he said. Kakashi shrugged and charged forward to meet him. The pair then clashed blades for the nth time that day, sending yet another spray of sparks in all directions. I'm not cruel enough to insult a dead man. Haku struggled to keep her breathing pattern consistent as her back was ground against the rough concrete. It certainly didn't hold that she was more or less being choked by her collar. She was being dragged away to her demise like a rabbit caught by a wolf. She was battered up and down. Her head pounded, her ribs were bruised, her legs were deadened, and her wrist had just been viciously snapped in multiple places. She was unable to fight back in any meaningful way. Not anymore. As such, she gave no resistance when she was whipped up from the ground and suspended in the air once again. For the second time, she was face-to-face with Nar, whose expression was just a tad less maddened than it had been. He still glared at her with boundless contempt, but he seemed to have reined himself in just a tad. A quick glance downward revealed that she was dangling over a river far below. She was being held over the edge of the bridge. I don't know what you told him or how you said it, but you've got Shikamaru more on your side than he should be. Naruto said roughly. Haku met his fiery blood-red eyes and maintained her look of apathy. He's quite naive, very sweet, but definitely naive, she said as clearly as was possible given her position. The blonde snorted and tightened his grip on her collar. Don't talk like you know him. All you did was use him for information. I still think you'd have killed him if I hadn't shown up, he said. The huntress shook her head slightly and stared up at the storming sky. I had 3 chances to kill him today. Each of them, I either ignored or purposefully botched. If I wanted your teammate dead, he would be. We've been over this, he said. Nar stared at her silently for a moment. Why, then why didn't you kill him? You were just fine with murdering Satsuki, he questioned. Haku met his eyes again and blinked a raindrop out of her right eye. I don't like to kill people. I only do it when I have to, which is quite often. My talks with Shikamaru happened outside of battle. I had no reason to hurt him. I actually came to quite like him. She admitted. Nar bared his teeth. Quit trying to make yourself out as a victim. You killed a girl. You killed my friend. Nothing you say is going to get you sympathy from me. He hissed. Haku swallowed a sum of blood that had accumulated in her mouth. For whatever it's worth, it was nothing personal. I was doing my job, she said calmly. The genin's frame shook slightly. It means nothing. She's still dead. She can't come back. She's gone because of you, he said unsteadily. Each time he referenced his fallen comrade, he grew more emotional. Haku studied him for a moment as she dangled over the edge. Did you love her? She asked curiously, much to the huntress' surprise. Nar shook his head and steeled himself to erase any emotion that had been present on his face. No, I didn't. Not the way you're saying, but she was something else to me. Something I'd never had before, he began, taking a labored breath between thoughts to fuel himself. I've got nothing. I've always had nothing. Ever since the day I was born. Then when I became a ninja, they gave me a team. They gave me my first family, or at least something like it, he said with downcast eyes. After a moment, he continued, I finally had people to care about and people who cared for me, even if only a little. You went and took that away. You killed the only friend I've ever made. I'll never forgive you for that, he said with anguish-laced passion. His gaze had returned to her, and it was as intense as ever behind his weak veil of composure. At his words, Haku let out a weak laugh. It's funny. We aren't all that different. I made my first friend this week, too. And I'm about to lose him as well. She said quietly, looking past Naruto's shoulder to Shikamaru, who was watching them with a look of pained discomfort. Picking up on this easily, Nar straightened the arm he was holding her with fully. You don't deserve friendship, he said coldly. Sensing what was to come, Haku locked eyes with Shikamaru and gave him a soft apologetic smile. Then, in an instant, Naruto let go of her robe collar. As she plummeted down toward the river below, the lonely huntress closed her eyes and folded her hands over her chest. Maybe in another life, Shikamaru, all that was visible was the lack of visibility itself. An endless sea of darkness permeated by no sound. A void of nothingness. Swimming through it all, Satsuki could find nothing but her own consciousness. The pain was gone, but no positivity or comfort had replaced it. She was simply numb and silent. 10. After a near eternity of nothingness, feelings began to return. The feeling of a slight wind across her face, the cold of what felt like rain, and even the sounds of a distant commotion. Over time, each and every one of these individual sensations coalesced into a coherent whole. Her vision snapped back into frame. Her ears began to function once more, and her skin felt the world around her anew. Having a clear memory of what had occurred to presumably send her to the dark void in which she had been trapped. Satsuki knew for certain that some way, somehow, she was alive again. Or perhaps she had never died in the first place. It was difficult to know. As she attempted to sit up, a sharp pain ripped through her body and kept her lying flat on her back. Though she had survived, she was far from healthy. Finding that moving her neck in any way at all was tremendously painful, Satsuki resigned herself to only moving her eyes to scan her surroundings. Eventually, after several moments of searching, she found a familiar sight. Shikamaru, if he's alive. Then she thought to herself as she spotted the Nara standing rigidly a fair few meters away from her. With great haste, she swept her vision across its entire range in search of her remaining comrade. After a brief, panicked few seconds, she located Nar. He was standing at the edge of the bridge, staring over the edge. The longer she studied him, the more unsettled she became. To begin with, his entire body was outlined by a faint glowing ember of what appeared to be red chakra. With her vision focusing further, she noticed that his nails appeared to be more akin to claws and that his frame was shaking slightly. Slowly, gradually, the blonde turned around and stepped away from the bridge's edge. At the sight of his face, Satsuki's eyes widened and her chest tightened. His eyes were dark red with slitted pupils. The whisker markings on his cheeks were distinctly thicker, and his canines were sharp fangs. More than the sheer shock factor of his appearance, the look of deeply rooted despair on his face. There was a sizable stream of blood dripping down his face from his hairline, and it looked poised to mix with tears that were already threatening to fall from his eyes. He looked miserable, overwhelmingly so. He was crying for me before, so I guess that makes sense. Maybe he's a little gentler than he lets on. Satsuki thought to herself, adding the blonde's expressive shows of empathy to the list of traits she silently defined him by. She then returned her attention to the scene before her, with Nar walking back toward Shikamaru. What followed was an exchange of words that Satsuki couldn't quite hear. They don't look all that happy with each other. Nar especially. What did I miss? The Uchiha girl pondered. It was then that she realized that a very pivotal entity was missing from the setting. The huntress was nowhere to be seen. Did Nar get rid of her? Did he actually manage to win? She thought to herself, completely dumbstruck by the possibility. She had indeed encouraged her teammate to fight on as she had been presumed to be dying. But it would have been disingenuous to say that she had expected him to prevail, not in the state he was in when she had left him. In the midst of her baseless attempts to make sense of what she was seeing, Shikamaru cast an odd glance in her direction. Apparently, her restored vitality was obvious to the eye because the Nar immediately broke out into a jog toward her. Within moments, he was knelt down by her side. A beat later, he looked back over his shoulder and waved for Naruto to join him. Get over here. She's still alive. He yelled to the blonde. Any animosity that had existed less than a minute prior vanished instantly from Naruto's face. He came running with no questions asked. When he reached them, he practically fell over, trying to stop himself. Luckily, he caught himself in time to kneel down next to Shikamaru. With both of her teammates looming over her, Satsuki opted to attempt to use her voice for the first time since her awakening. What did I miss? She asked hoarsely. At the sound of her voice, Naruto's eyes instantly shifted back from red to their natural blue. His fangs shortened, his claws disappeared, and the anguish on his face melted away. She received no verbal answer to her question. Instead, she was swiftly scooped up from the concrete and tightly hugged by Nar. Thank God, he whispered. Satsuki let out a slight yelp of pain at having been so suddenly moved. Her teammate responded by lightening his grip on her, though he kept her pinned to his chest. After adjusting to the new position somewhat, the Uchiha girl relented and returned the embrace as best she could. I appreciate the concern, but you could have warned me, she said, her voice muffled by his shoulder. Nar shook his head and took a deep breath to calm himself down. He was clearly emotional. I don't care. You're still alive. You're not gone, he said quietly. Satsuki blinked several times, but allowed herself to relax and smile slightly at his innocent relief at her safety. I'm okay. It'll take more than some sewing supplies to kill me. You don't have to cry, Nar, she said softly in reference to the slight tremors she could feel working through his body. Finally giving her space, Nar gently laid her down on the bridge surface and wiped his eyes. Sorry, I was just really worried, he said honestly with a sniffle. Suppressing her silent appreciation for his purity, Satsuki propped herself up on her elbows and looked to Shikamaru, who was sitting quite awkwardly to the left of them. Could you give me a summary? I feel like a bunch has happened, she requested. The Nar nodded and took a deep breath to prepare himself to give his account of the events. You actually haven't been out all that long. Maybe 15 minutes. For starters, Naruto beat the life out of Hawk, the huntress. He was probably well on his way to killing her when he threw her off the bridge. I doubt she could swim in the condition she was in, he said. There was then an odd pause. He hardly looked happy about what he was reporting. She's probably drowned by now if the impact with the water didn't kill her immediately, he concluded in a fairly weak tone. Satsuki furrowed her brow and glanced at Naruto to see if he understood Shikamaru's demeanor any better than she did. The blonde's expression had shifted from relieved and overjoyed back to irritated and somewhat angered. Whatever was afoot regarding Shikamaru's feelings toward what had happened to the huntress, Naruto strongly disliked it. Changing the subject for the sake of relieving tension, Satsuki turned her head toward the opposite end of the bridge. Looks like Kakashi is still at it with Zabuza, she commented, drawing the attention of the two boys toward the wearing jonin. Though it was difficult to tell through the still present mist at the distance they were at, it appeared that Kakashi had taken the upper hand. Should we join in? Satsuki suggested as the rogue swordsman was visibly staggered by a strike from their teacher. Interestingly, it was Naruto that shook his head in denial of the notion. Even if he's getting beat up, we probably can't do anything to him. I might have been able to help out a few minutes ago, but not now, he said. The image of her teammates' blood-red eyes and fangs then flashed across Satsuki's mind. We should at least get closer. If something goes wrong, we need to be there, Shikamaru said firmly. The Uchiha girl nodded in agreement. Having realized that he was outnumbered, Naruto gave a reluctant nod. Fine, I guess that makes some sense, he muttered. He then frowned and looked to either side of their location. Where's Suna? He asked curiously. It was a fair question to ask, given that the entire point of their battle with the Huntress had been to keep the bridge builder clear of harm and injury. Behind you. No worries. The bridge builder in question, who was the owner of the new voice, then joined the group from behind them. He looked almost entirely unharmed, which was a success in and of itself. Shikamaru and Naruto then rose to their feet to begin the short journey toward Kakashi and Zabuza. When Satsuki moved to join them, she found that her legs had very limited strength. In particular, her left leg was almost entirely useless at the moment. With her cheeks slightly red, the girl cleared her throat. Could I get a little help? She called out meekly to her team, who had begun to walk away. Nar glanced back over his shoulder and did a short double take. He then jogged back over to her and crouched down by her side. How much can you walk? He asked. Satsuki gave standing up on her own another try, only to fail quite miserably. With a shake of her head, she settled on her rear and rubbed her left thigh. Not at all, I don't think, she admitted. She despised it, but she needed help moving. Easily noticing her complete lack of mobility, the blonde turned his back to her and kept his levels lowered down to match hers. I know you're going to hate the idea, but get on my back. We don't have a ton of time to waste, he said. Flushing a deep red immediately, Satsuki held her tongue and kept her urge to yell at him for even suggesting the method in check. Practically glowing with embarrassment, Satsuki scooted forward and pulled herself up onto him by his shoulders. Nar then carefully hooked his arms under her legs and stood up. This okay? He asked, though she was well aware he was referring to the pain in her legs. Satsuki ducked her head down into the base of his neck to hide her burning face. No, and if you say anything about it or touch me wrong, I'll strangle you on the spot, she threatened. Despite the severity of the situation, Naruto managed a laugh and began walking to catch up with Suna and Shikamaru. Good to know that dying didn't change you much. Kakashi aggressively pressed forward as he sensed the waning strength of his foe. Zabuza had proven himself to be a more than worthy challenger, but the gap between them had continually widened. As the fight had progressed, the Jonin was faster, slicker, and more powerful when it came down to the depth of their reserves. Having wobbled Zabuza a moment earlier with a solid knee to the side of his jaw, Kakashi entered the rogue's space once again and struck him 3 times in the gut, leg, and temple. The multi-leveled assault backed Zabuza up further, allowing for Kakashi to whirl into a whipping kick that landed squarely with the heel across his foe's face. Zabuza finally crashed to the ground with a harsh thud. It's been fun, but I don't have any more time for you, Kakashi said. Then he sequenced 3 simple hand seals and gripped his right wrist down by his waist. A circle of sparking blue electricity then formed around the silver-haired ninja accompanied by a deafening choir of wailing bird-like chirps. Once fully charged, Kakashi locked his eyes on Zabuza, who was halfway to his feet. Reikiri, he yelled. The rogue swordsman immediately attempted to move as he sensed the Jonin's oncoming blitz, but abruptly stopped in his track, leaving him in the path of the devastating jutsu heading his way. A split second later, Zabuza was impaled through his right shoulder by Kakashi's lightning-cloaked fist. Blood quickly soaked through the bandages covering his mouth as he sank to his knees with the Jonin's arms still stabbing through him. Don't bother fighting back anymore. Even if that didn't kill you right away, you'll bleed out in a few minutes, Kakashi said, ripping his hand free as he spoke. He then looked straight ahead and quickly identified the culprit behind Zabuza's sudden freezing. Didn't I tell you all not to interfere? He asked Shikamaru, who was emerging from the mist alongside Zabuza. The Nar shrugged and gestured to the severely injured rogue on the concrete ground. I'd say that I've earned a pass for being disobedient this time, don't you think? He said. Kakashi sighed and returned his attention to the badly bleeding Zabuza. Fair enough. Just don't think that what you just pulled is going to fly most of the time, he said. A moment later, the remainder of his team arrived. Nar slowly emerged from the mist and stood alongside the Nara. Funnily enough, Satsuki was piggybacking him, and she was hiding her face behind Naruto's neck. Despite her efforts, her ears were still visible and they were bright pink. She's in rough shape physically and mentally. Kakashi joked to himself, shelving the thought for the moment. He kept his eyes fixed on Zabuza, who was on one knee with a hand over his bandaged mouth. If you have anything to say or that you'd like me to record, I'm feeling generous. Kakashi offered. The rogue shook his head and coughed painfully as he clutched his horribly wounded shoulder. I don't need your sympathy. Besides, even now, I could probably kill one of your brats without much issue, he said raspily. The Jonin narrowed his eyes and pressed a kunai to his neck. Try it, and I'll make your head roll, he said menacingly. Zabuza chuckled and held up a falsely defensive hand. He then gestured east toward the land beyond the bridge. I'd rather die with my dignity intact. I'll concede to you. At least I can say it took a big name to end me, he said. He then muscled his way to his feet despite his mortal wound. All of that aside, you should all get moving. They'll be here soon, he said vaguely. Before any member of Team 7 could demand elaboration of some kind, the distant sound of pounding footsteps registered in their eardrums. Zabuza promptly made a brief hand seal, which cleared away the mist. Around a quarter mile from the bridge, like a swarm of locusts, was a mob of armed men. Who are they? Friends of yours? Kakashi asked. Zabuza shrugged his shoulders and took hold of the bandages on his jawline. Only by assignment. They're here for the same thing I am. That's God's mob. I'm sure you've heard that name before, he explained. The Jonin nodded and kept his eyes narrowed as the crowd approached. There were 50 of them at a bare minimum. Even if they were all hopelessly weak individually, swarms of enemies were always a pain to contend with. Then, just as Kakashi was about to begin barking orders to his team, Zabuza ripped the bandages from his face. I'll do you one single favor. I'll handle this trash heap, he said roughly as his injury festered. Kakashi eyed him skeptically and took a step back. What's in this for you? I don't buy it, he asked. The rogue swordsman drew a kunai as a poor replacement for his now lost blade. A smirk then spread across his serrated teeth. I've wanted to make that taste his own blood for a while now. He's with them. I can feel him in there. So, I guess you could say I'm treating myself just as much as I'm helping you, he said openly. Though he was far from trusting of Zabuza in any sense, weighing his options quickly produced the conclusion that accepting the proposal was wisest. Giving a curt nod, Kakashi turned his back and gestured for his team to follow him. Let's move. There's a chance he dies before he can take care of them all. So, be on your toes, he said to his genin before they could move out fully. Zabuza called out to them one last time. Oh, and one last thing. Haku isn't quite dead yet. I'm not sure how she survived the pounding Blondie put on her, but I can sense her chakra. Do with that information what you will, he said just loudly enough for the cell to hear. Kakashi nodded, noting the information mentally. I'll keep that in mind, he said before ushering his group along and leaving Zabuza alone at the end of the bridge. Finally alone, the rogue swordsman planted his feet and awaited the arrival of the man he so hated. You always used to say that I had a gambling problem, and maybe you were right, but that one was for you, Haku. Shikamaru pursed his lips as he made his way toward the bank of the river. Just over 4 hours had passed since the climactic duel upon the bridge just over his head, and judging by the silence and uneventfulness of the day following the events, Zabuza had managed to either slaughter the mob by his lonesome or scare them away. The Nar hadn't made the trek back to ponder those things, though. No, he was there for something he was far less confident in, far less sure of. Oh, and one last thing. Haku isn't quite dead yet. I've got no way to know if he was even telling the truth. I don't see why he wouldn't have been. But still, he thought to himself with little certainty as he scaled the banks. Beyond the simple question of validity regarding Haku's apparent survival and whether or not she would even still be alive hours after the fighting had ended, the fact remained that Shikamaru had snuck out unannounced. Once again, his team had already grown suspicious of him days prior, and now they knew the reason. As he walked along the edges of the water, his aimlessness grew. He knew who he had come for, but he had no concept about what he planned to do if he found the huntress. None whatsoever. Shaking his head, Shikamaru picked up the pace at which he was walking. For the following minute, he did nothing but walk in a straight line, pondering his own decision-making. It was only when he stepped on something of a different density than the damp mud at his feet that he stopped. Taking what was meant to be a cursory glance downward, Shikamaru saw something that froze him in his tracks. He had stepped on a hand. Slowly following the hand up the arm, he identified its owner. By pure chance, he had stumbled upon exactly who he had come to search for against his better judgment. Haku was laying on the bank with her lower half still submerged in the water. Immediately upon realizing what he had found, Shikamaru knelt down and checked for a pulse on the side of her neck. Though it took time, he eventually found one. It was faint, but it was distinct. She was just barely clinging to life. With her status confirmed, Shikamaru carefully pulled her fully out of the water and laid her on her back. Blue lips, pale skin, cold hands. She's definitely got hypothermia, he thought to himself grimly. Beyond her likely medical ailment, she was also badly injured across her entire body. Her face was covered in cuts and bruises, and her wrist had swelled up from having been broken by Nar. Shikamaru monitored the rising and falling of her chest for several moments. What do I even want to do? I can't just leave here, but is bringing her back really an option, he pondered. A brief return to Naruto's brutal rage drew a shud-tearing breath from his lungs. Nar would tear me in half for it. And I can't imagine Satsuki would like it a ton either. Sensei, he's a wild card. He thought to himself. It was a horrid choice. Either leave Haku to inevitably die in the hours to come or risk alienation from his own cell. Shikamaru Naru was capable of performing under pressure and largely always had been. But the sheer moral magnitude of the situation before him was crushing. Clenching his jaw, Shikamaru gripped his temples. Why, I even care. You lied to me. That's all you did. You played me like a fiddle. God, I'm such a kid. He hissed to both himself and the unconscious girl before him. His eyes had clamped shut amid his conflicted thoughts. Shaking his head, the Nar sighed heavily. And here I am, down in the mud for you. Just because I can't tell right from wrong anymore, he said quietly. A stirring sound then caught his attention. He snapped to attention and saw that Haku's eyes were a crack open. She was gazing directly at him for reasons he couldn't properly pin down. The sight of her eyes made the decision for him. As gently as he could, Shikamaru picked her up off the bank with a grip under her legs and upper back. Why? Haku whispered softly as she was cradled and carried away from the cold water. Shikamaru swallowed a lump in his throat and shook his head, not daring to take his eyes away from the path directly ahead of him. I don't know. I honestly have no idea, he said weakly. The huntress said no more. She simply tucked her head into his abdomen and returned to the hazy sleep that had taken her hours beforehand. Within a few minutes, Shikamaru reached the path that would take him all the way back to Suna's house with Haku still bundled in his arms. Unfortunately, the path wasn't empty when he reached it. Well, now what do we have here? Kakashi, who was standing in the center of the path with his arms folded across his chest, inquired. Judging by the look on his face and by the tone of his voice, he wasn't the least bit surprised by what he was seeing. Casting his eyes to the ground, Shikamaru tried and failed to sound poised. I just think she could have some information we could use. She might have a bounty on her head or something, he muttered. Kakashi sighed and made his way up to his student. He then put a hand on his shoulder. I can't stress this enough, kid. Never get emotionally involved. It's hard, I know, but this is exactly why, he said. Shikamaru glanced up and met the man's eyes briefly. So that's a no to the information idea? He asked. The silver-haired ninja assessed Haku's sleeping form carefully for a few seconds. If she survives, which is a big if, then I'm way too tired to kill her myself. I think the rest of the team are too, even if they'd probably like to try. Thing is, if we bring her back, there's every chance she gets executed anyway. There's no way she doesn't have dozens of bodies to her credit, he said honestly. The Nara nodded dejectedly. I know that and I know how stupid I'm being. I feel like an idiot. I really do. I just can't walk away. She's a human being. He said. Kakashi put his hand on his left hip. And so will every person that you kill in your career. It's never going to be easy, but getting attached is never going to do you any favors. Especially not at your age, he said bluntly. Shikamaru tensed slightly as Haku shifted in his arms, but calmed again when she remained unconscious. And this is the last time I'll make that mistake. He swore as strongly as he could muster. Kakashi motioned for the genin to follow him, to which Shikamaru obliged. For a time, they walked in silence through the path, which was lined with wild trees. As much as think what you did was stupid, irrational, and just plainly a bad idea, the one thing I will say is that it's convinced me that you'll be a fine man someday, the Jonin said after a time. He then turned and faced his student again. My philosophy is that the rules come second to your comrades. That girl isn't your comrade or your friend, no matter what you've managed to convince yourself of, but I guess you've got the right idea with your priorities. You're a good kid, Shikamaru, he said. Shikamaru adjusted his grip on Haku and nodded. Thanks for that. I'll try to think less emotionally next time, he said. Kakashi gave him a thumbs up and gestured toward the light of the house, which was now visible in the distance. Let's go and get this over. So guys, what do you think about this Naruto story? Tell me your opinion in the comments. And if you want more Naruto what if stories, make sure to subscribe to Universe of Naruto. Thanks for watching.